At that time, the sovereign of the realm of Aden was indeed a tyrant. Not only did he ruthlessly slay his enemies before the eyes of all, but he also took the lives of their offspring, even if they were mere infants. Furthermore, he harbored disdain for his own servants who endeavored to offer him counsel, risking their lives in the process. Undoubtedly, he was a deranged murderer, mercilessly extinguishing even his allies. Ultimately, under the rule of such a cruel tyrant, unmatched by any monarch in history, the capital became a city of prolonged silence, fear, and bloodshed. In an era where the sole objective of humanity was the desire to endure, within the domain of Count Luxon, two beloved daughters existed. The elder, Ljubljana, and the younger, Kalina. Once, when Ljubljana was 15 years old, observing her younger sister, she resolved to bestow a fitting gift upon the beautiful and exceptionally intelligent sibling. Ljubljana, cognizant that during these challenging times, the inheritance of titles was not contingent upon birth order, and pondering who truly possessed the right to intertwine families and titles, was approached by Kalina at that moment. Kalina affirmed that she had made her choice, and this matter suited her more than anything else. The elder one merely smiled lightly, understanding that in this sense, her sister must become the next Countess Luxon. With a cry to withdraw her hands from her belongings, the heroine pulled her sister away. He traversed the corridor, and towards them hurried an uncle visibly perturbed. Subsequently, he declared that he had just received a call from the capital, revealing that their parents had been brutally slain while she pondered over the future. Before she could inform her parents of her decision, they were summoned to the capital and met their demise. Later, the lifeless bodies were returned for the funeral rites. Kalina, in despair, wept, and it seemed as though everyone around was immersed in tears. Only Ljubljana, with horror, observed this. Discussions arose about this situation, as no one knew the true culpability of the count. They spoke as if upon a pearl gifted to the king, a single flaw had been discovered. The funerals were supposed to last for 3 days, but the condition of the deceased was simply dreadful. The father's attempt to shield them, renouncing authority and departing from the capital, ultimately proved futile, and thus, it was unforgivable. The day when peace in their family was shattered filled the heroine with unwavering resolve, once and for all, and since then, time passed imperceptibly. On an occasion with merely a month remaining until her 20th birthday, Ljubljana greeted her sister on her 18th birthday, presenting a special ring. Other guests recognized this gift as the Luxon family seal ring, signifying only one thing: Ljubljana was relinquishing her title to her younger sister. All were greatly astonished by such news, including the uncle. He marveled at the notion that the young lady would forsake her status and forego her inheritance. She had, in fact, informed him of this decision earlier, despite his assurances that a ceremony had already taken place on her 18th birthday. The young lady remained unswayed, asserting that the opportune moment had not yet arrived. However, it seemed that that moment was unfolding right now. Presently, the heroine declared her intention to enter the monastery near the palace. She had pondered this extensively after the demise of her parents, contemplating how she wished to live her entire life as a nun and retreat from the world. Suddenly, in the midst of the night, the sister began to rouse the young lady. Despite the latter's attempt to feign deep slumber, Kalina perceived otherwise and persisted in her efforts. Subsequently, she explained that she already knew the reason why her sister desired to enter the monastery. The younger one clarified the motive, revealing that Ljubljana genuinely yearned to save her life to the fullest, indulging in pleasures without the need for discipline. The family had sacrificed significantly for this cause, allowing the heroine to sleep and revel therefore up to 20 hours a day. Beside herself with her sister's reasoning, the young lady felt disconcerted. Nevertheless, as she turned, she asserted that she had no intention of sleeping for 20 hours a day. Kalina, however, pointed out that one needs to eat thrice a day, which translates to only 15 hours. Ljubljana declared that if everything was already known, then she should make a donation to the abbot. He is quite a covetous person, and if the amount is reduced, he may demand it from her. Suddenly, Kalina embraced her sister, stating that it was not necessary to speak so harshly. Irritated, Ljubljana insisted that she did not force her to write letters first. Nevertheless, if she sends one herself, a response is obligatory. After a moment, noticeably sobered, the heroine requested that her sister not even contemplate revenge. One must simply live as they do. She will enjoy life in moderation, while the sister, being intelligent, will take care of the family. Miraculously, the heroine had acquired few possessions: a bit of clothing, a couple of books, and the handmade bow and arrows from her parents. She lived in the monastery, leading a calm and measured life, responding each day to the letters from her sister. Those missives were replete with the affairs of the kingdom, which each day only worsened. Tales of the tyrant's journeys, proclaiming his perpetual youth while bathing in the blood of children, and demanding exorbitant tax sums that even beggared the nobility. In response to all this nonsense, she simply shook her head, refraining from mentioning anything associated with the term tyrant. 4 years had transpired since she commenced dwelling in the monastery. On that day, a flustered nun hastened to her, declaring that it was not the time to rest, for guests had arrived, and she needed to proceed there immediately. The heroine surmised who had come to meet her and promptly set forth. There, she beheld the one closest to her sister, whom she had not seen in several years. Sister smiled and began discussing that she was ready, and the time had come at last to overthrow and vanquish the scoundrel. Hence, she required assistance, and together they would assuredly accomplish their objective. Ljubljana relinquished her noble title and the responsibility of tending to her family to her astute younger sister. In this harsh world, she made this decision deeming it the optimal choice to preserve the title and safeguard her sister, while she spent all these 4 years training in the rear courtyard of the monastery just in case. Her intelligent sister finally devised a way to overthrow the scoundrel. However, she found herself lacking in the ability to protect their family and land. Kalina emerged, fully prepared to oust the tyrant. Ultimately, the sister implored for assistance. Faced with such a plea in this situation, the heroine had only one response: to aid her sister. Thus, kneeling, the nun declared that her birth name was Ljubljana, but henceforth she would be known as Crystal. As a former member of the Luxon family, she vowed that her sword and arrows would be directed at her enemies, and her shield would defend her until her last breath. She pledged to love and respect her, serving with the entirety of her soul. Kalina silently observed this, contorting her expression at the end. Drawing her sword, she entreated not to betray her faith in this oath. The sweetness of fidelity contrasts with the poisonous fruit of betrayal, both body and soul loyal to God. Yet now, she wholly belonged to her, bestowing upon her a new name. Both names now belonged to her, Ljubljana Crystal von Yashlan. It was time to raise the sword and follow only her lead. Ljubljana understood that she was not a fervent believer, not particularly believing in its existence at all. However, if perchance they were indeed God's beloved children, as inscribed in the Bible, she would like to request divine guidance for her sister. May they protect her sibling. The nun grasped the sword so firmly that blood started flowing from her hand. Her voice addressed the heavens, assuring that if aid were granted in this endeavor, she was willing to offer her firstborn to them. The cohort following Kalina had become a formidable force. Her army now comprised nobles and the people of the south, previously persecuted by the tyrant. Additionally, monks from the monastery, who had been monitoring her, joined in. The army didn't head directly to the center, but moved slowly toward the north and west. In the west, the local count hoisted a white flag, opened the gates, and as a demonstration of his surrender, sacrificed his finest swordsman and son, Ludante. Thanks to the capitulation of Count Dominant, they acquired the west without bloodshed. Soon after, Ljubljana received orders from her sister, and set off to the eastern part of the kingdom. There, a brief skirmish unfolded. Every time she encountered enemies, she vanquished them, one by one. There was only one adversary she couldn't slay: the chief defender of the East, Felthurg Cadric. In the moment when the arrow was released, he instantly reacted to it. Not only did he manage to evade death, but he also swiftly reached the archer. Despite having lost one eye earlier due to an arrow, he now intended to seek retribution for it. Then the sword penetrated her shoulder, and having received a blow each, they sat peacefully at the negotiation table. With a pierced shoulder and a missing eye, the defender then informed that surrender was not part of their plans. If they had already decided that the West had readily accepted the proposal, they had no intention of doing the same. As soon as Ljubljana realized that a quick resolution was unattainable, she burst into the room. The sister was eager to learn about Ljubljana's well-being, and Felthurg Cadric suddenly broke into a sweat. In an unsure moment, he declared their agreement, shocking everyone present. He immediately stood up and bowed before his recent adversary. Initially, the girl thought he might make a suitable suitor, but it seemed not. She vowed on blood that marriage was inevitable, but should not be rushed. First, Kalina should be made empress, and only then should considerations for matrimony arise. And so, on a day when the west, east, and north were already in their hands, this army set its course towards the center, the capital. Wearied by the tyranny of the ruler, the capital offered no resistance. As the rebellion of the county of Luxon unfolded, the citizens scattered flowers, welcoming them wholeheartedly. Without significant challenges, they passed through the 7 gates, finding themselves in the heart of the capital. However, as they prepared to confront the king, an unexpected guest awaited them. Then, a delegation from the king arrived and entered. They informed with a smile that their gracious king had requested to convey that, though she may be a rebel, she could still become his concubine and bear him a son. In that case, he would pardon her transgressions. However, Ljubljana did not tolerate this impudence and promptly dealt with them. On that night, the final battle took place. The royal army proved competent for only one night. Its unskilled fighters were preoccupied with fleeing, and the tyrant, in his final seconds, desperately offered them anything they desired: money or land. If she sought a kingdom, they could achieve it together. Then, he was slain by Kalina's sword. Finally, she avenged her parents' deaths. The next day dawned, and her soul sister, Kalina, ascended to rule the kingdom. Ljubljana was simply relieved that everything had finally concluded. If her sister assumed the throne, there remained only the fulfillment of the blood oath. When the queen unexpectedly returned after greeting the people, the girl announced her desire to transform the kingdom into an empire, seeking assistance. If Ljubljana were to aid her, they must also capture a dragon, as the empress's throne should be adorned with dragon skin. Nonetheless, the sister reconciled with the empress and dragons, simply assisting to the best of her abilities. Over time, they occupied all neighboring kingdoms. Most were initially obliterated and subsequently absorbed. Some on the outskirts were left undisturbed, swearing allegiance. In conclusion, for the dragon hunt, the four ventured into the mountains. Kalina calmly and nonchalantly directed the battle, while the rest risked their lives. She also requested caution, urging them to avoid damaging the dragon skin. It was then that Ljubljana pointed out she had narrowly escaped being crushed by the dragon. At the end of the brutal battle, Dante carved out the dragon's eyes and heart. Eventually, Kalina ascended the throne adorned with dragon skin, donned a crown with a dragon heart, and became the first empress. Always by her side were 3 who served her wholeheartedly. They were rewarded with the titles of dukes, and lands were allocated to them by the empress. Dominant, with black tulips, received the western lands. Felther Kadrik, from the Iron Cross, obtained the southern lands. The heroine, as she was called Yeshlian, with a silver lily, received the notorious northern lands. Beasts born of dragons' blood were tainted, and the only humans there were prisoners. Those were truly forsaken lands. Kalina then assured that, as she trusted her, she was ready to allocate the northern lands to her. Therefore, she needed to defend her empire, to which the heroine didn't even know what to respond. Upon receiving the decree from her soul sister, the empress, she promptly journeyed north, reforming the criminals into ordinary citizens and levying taxes upon them. Those with no limb issues underwent training as soldiers, and after driving out the monsters, they erected a tall wall to minimize losses. Finally, relatively tranquil times dawned on this land. One day, a letter arrived bearing the empress's seal, and on that 29th year of her life, the heroine received orders to return to the capital. Returning, Ljubljana couldn't believe her eyes. The city that suffered from tyranny just a few years ago, the capital she hadn't visited for a long time, had greatly transformed under Kalina's rule, resembling a true imperial capital. Nevertheless, to everyone, she became a ruthless northern savage. Rumors circulated about the duchess's return, weaving tales as if she were exceedingly formidable, with 3 eyes and a height exceeding 2 meters. It was said she could effortlessly decapitate a beast with one hand. The heroine began to ponder whether they had contracted some malady causing amnesia. Upon informing the empress, she merely chuckled, curious if the duchess had taken those rumors seriously. She pointed out that they should have just turned a deaf ear to them. Ljubljana inquired whether Kalina had dispelled these rumors, but she insisted that she never entertained such thoughts. However, the duchess knew her sister well, and it meant that she indeed did. The empress assured them that she merely recounted the challenging situation in the north, so that they wouldn't forget the heroine's efforts, and could express their gratitude. As for those peculiar rumors, they had already dispelled them on their own. Therefore, she was invited to stay in the capital for a while, and these gossip would quickly fade away. Moreover, there were still numerous organizational challenges, and her assistance was greatly needed here. However, Ljubljana realized it was time to gradually seek a suitable husband, the first child to be dedicated to the gods, and the second to inherit the title of duke. Preserving loyalty to the emperor required finding someone who could effortlessly help her raise at least 2 children. Hence, a robust gentleman was needed. Upon her arrival in the capital, Kalina allocated a residence for her sister near the imperial palace. Upon entering, the duchess was greatly surprised. Previously, she received invitations that were bundled together, intending to decline them all. However, she acquiesced to one selected by the empress and her lady-in-waiting. To showcase the camaraderie among the 3 new dukes and bolster Kalina's authority, was to overshadow the glamorous boors of the capital. Lady-in-waiting meticulously curated social gatherings frequented by the young elite. The duchess was discontented with this arrangement, already blaming herself for agreeing to it. The lady-in-waiting explained that a refined lady should not conduct herself in such a manner, likening her to her grandmother. The girl couldn't argue against it, and should forget about her previous outburst, even the incident where the heroine tore her gown. Perhaps it was worth attempting to move forward. Attending such an event, Ljubljana understood that today was just like any other banquet she had attended, arranged by the Marquis. It purported to be a gathering where unmarried young ladies and gentlemen participated to showcase their knowledge and engage in discussions about the state of the empire. However, the reality was different. It was an occasion where everyone could peacefully propose to meet without the obligation of marriage. Presently, Ljubljana stood to the side, a glass of wine in her hands, reveling in the fact that the lady-in-waiting couldn't see her. She even gave her a pocket watch, but it turned out to be futile. The lady-in-waiting explained that it was a fashionable accessory nowadays and should be flaunted in public. As she spoke, she emphasized the need to choose someone virtuous and devoid of ambitions during conversations. With these words, the woman reminded the heroine of her grandmother. In her childhood, she explained to the girl that she would undoubtedly find a good man without any ambitions. When the child asserted that she would marry a handsome and intelligent man, her grandmother assured her that such a man would choose a girl from an influential family in the capital. Therefore, she needed to find a man who wouldn't harm her reputation and wealth. Recalling these words, Ljubljana agreed with her grandmother. She now needed a good and robust man who could assist her in conceiving at least 2 children. Of course, during the Civil War, many admirable men had perished, but it was essential not to waste time. The main priority now was to bear 2 children. Upon seeing her, 2 other guests suddenly became flustered, for it was Yeshlian, the Northern Queen. She was a ruthless killer, rumored during the full moon battles to have neither tears nor blood, a true bloodthirsty duchess. It was also said that she drove not only the northern residents, but also the beasts. Hence, she earned the moniker Queen of Beasts. Such words struck a chord with the heroine. The other duchesses, seemingly more deranged than she, focused their discourse solely on her. Despite the fact that they now enjoyed safety thanks to her efforts, they dared to speak in such a manner. Filled with indignation, she tightened her grip on the glass until, at one moment, it shattered. A servant quickly came to her aid, assuring her that everything was in order. The Duchess herself speculated that the Marquis might be facing financial troubles if he resorted to such inferior tableware. However, at that moment, practically all present, especially the other women, drew attention to her, perplexed as to why she too identified as a woman. Suddenly, the heroine sensed an enigmatic gaze upon her, one bearing neither hatred nor consent, but rather an unyielding resolve. Eyes filled with these 3 no's, which she despised above all. It appeared that the girl who had fallen for her was engaged to one of those whose self-esteem had been wounded, yet they didn't dare challenge her to a duel. In a moment, the wife of the Marquis, the host of the event, approached her, and they began to converse. The Duchess expressed gratitude for the invitation, but the hostess refuted it, acknowledging that the presence of such an influential figure elevated her banquet to an entirely new level, something for which she was indebted. Subsequently, Ljubljana observed with regret that she had been rather inattentive, leading to her belongings becoming drenched. Hence, it was time for her departure. Stepping out into the street, the heroine noted that if she lingered, Ferlina would cast upon her a formidable gaze, questioning why she had returned so soon. However, in an unexpected moment of contemplation, one pondered whether a deity indeed existed. Kalina effortlessly vanquished the tyrant, ascended the throne, conquered neighboring realms, thereby establishing an empire, and assumed the title of empress. It was even perplexing how swiftly and effortlessly all this transpired. The sacred vow, pledged to the divine, demanded swift fulfillment. Yet, daily self-assurances notwithstanding, the reality of marriage was far from simple. At this very moment, a malicious voice asserted that she had no chance of evading matrimony. This remark captured her interest, and upon turning around, she beheld a man engaged in conversation with a woman. Ljubljana found this conversation intriguing. Among the myriad aspects of existence on this celestial sphere, matrimony stood out as an imperative. Who, in the grand scope of humanity, could discuss such matters, scrutinizing individuals? The woman was remarkably beautiful, and the man accompanying her appeared distinct. Clad in a conventional black suit with a white tie, he did not emanate the aura of aristocracy, lending an air of fascination to the entire scene. This gentleman possessed an extraordinary beauty. If indeed there is a divine being, the creator of not only this world but also angels, then he might well be one of them, the most exquisite yet harboring the most dreadful temperament. The woman, reaching out to him, implored him not to avoid her. However, he promptly shrugged her off, asserting that he did not recall permitting her to touch him. It seemed he was unfamiliar with manners. At that moment, he inquired about his whereabouts, confident she was somewhere nearby. In response, the woman assured him she wouldn't give up, and would do whatever it took to make him hers. Yet, all she received was a command to fall silent. The handsome man began to survey his surroundings, searching for the mysterious figure, while Ljubljana crouched in the bushes, thinking she was the one being sought. In a moment, she realized that the smiles around her were growing, causing her considerable embarrassment. Nevertheless, what she witnessed here somehow resembled entanglement in something profoundly exhausting. Though the ideal for her was a handsome man, his character appeared frightful. She, however, continued to seek a kind and robust man, as her grandmother advised, with no intention of forgetting those words. Subsequently, upon rejoining the banquet in the palace, Ljubljana observed that not long ago, such thoughts had crossed her mind. However, who could have known that she would encounter him here again? Nevertheless, in this setting, he conducted himself quite differently than in the garden. His gaze and hand movements seemed to melt the hearts of the young ladies, perhaps due to his extraordinary beauty, which appeared less repulsive. Suddenly, an old acquaintance approached her, none other than Finalizing. The Duchess was genuinely pleased to see him, to which he wryly remarked that she was more delighted to see the alcohol he brought with him. In a moment, they locked eyes with the handsome stranger, piquing his curiosity. The heroine amusingly inquired whether he even noticed how handsome the man was with one eye. Finalizing declared that he lost it due to someone, making him more sensitive. In response, the Duchess expressed her enduring embarrassment before him, specifically for her actions with Kalina's potential suitor. Nonetheless, Ljubljana was curious about his identity, as it seemed she was encountering him for the first time. The Duke affirmed that he was the grandson of Count Graham, signifying his association with a family close to the tyrant. During the midnight clash, on the day when the gates were breached, the entire family surrendered and bowed to Kalina. It was not extraordinary for them to face destruction, as was customary. However, the future empress decreed that if anyone besides the members of the royal family surrendered, their lives should be spared. Thanks to Kalina's kindness, they survived. The heroine perceived the Graham family as individuals who sought favor for survival. Following this, Count Graham acquired handsome men and offered them to Kalina. He would flatter her, shower her with gifts, all to remain in Kalina's proximity. The heroine was shocked upon witnessing the array of gifts from the Count. Curious, she inquired of the ruler what her course of action should be. Her sister assured her that she needed to convey to him as if the Empress admired everything. This meant she already had a plan in motion. Nonetheless, it all seemed rather peculiar now. As far as she could recall, the people of the Count had wheat-colored hair, brown eyes, and were generally lacking in muscle. They were tall and slender. Therefore, could someone have silver hair and black eyes? On the day the Graham family surrendered, they naturally inspected the Count and his family. It appeared that he might be the illegitimate son of the tyrant. At that moment, her hands trembled. Finalizing observed that information seemed to reach her rather belatedly. Subsequently, he uttered the name Louiseman Fen Lux Amel von Graham, inquiring if she was aware of the significance of this appellation. Ljubljana affirmed her acquaintance with the name, recognizing it as a royal lineage, resplendent silver hair, dark eyes, and a captivating visage. Nevertheless, she harbored disbelief at the prospect. The Duke affirmed that one could assert him to be the last of kin, or more precisely, the ultimate scion of the royal family. They annihilated the sole progeny of the tyrant. Ljubljana was now intrigued by how the illegitimate son of the tyrant managed to survive. During that battle, they had eradicated all his kin, as Felthurg confirmed newborns were not spared either. Hence, she wondered how he simply appeared at the banquet organized by the imperial palace. Felthurg assured her that not long ago, they discovered his true identity. He hailed from the House of Scholars, a place where people had confined themselves within towering walls, a group of deranged scholars, dedicated to a lifetime of learning. Upon entering, they had to renounce their given names and swear an oath to God that they would pursue knowledge until death. Access to this place from outside was granted only after one's demise. This abode was even more formidable than a monastery. They were respected both by ordinary folks and the tyrant himself, because the scholars maintained political neutrality. Even Kalina, who had overthrown the king, dared not touch the House of Scholars. The heroine could not fathom that in such a place, an illegitimate son of the tyrant would be born. It became clear how he survived, yet it was curious why he was present now. Felthurg noted that he had ties to the north, but the Duchess assured that she received no news from him. Felthurg asserted that such a circumstance could not be since he regularly dispatched individuals, and even submitted reports on the shared situation in the region. Was it possible that she had never perused the documents he sent? With a touch of irritation, he questioned whether she thought he had so much leisure time that he could handwrite letters every month, squandering paper. Felthurg, sighing heavily, elucidated that he consistently sent them so that Ljubljana wouldn't feel isolated and would possess general information about events in the capital. He tried his best, but it seemed futile. In response, the Duchess took a glass of wine and extended it to him, as if in a gesture of forgiveness. The man accepted it, declaring himself a fool if he felt relief from it. In any case, Ljubljana was still curious about the significance of this regarding the illegitimate son of the tyrant, who effortlessly roamed the imperial palace. She received an explanation that, by the Empress's decree, due to the insufficient staff and her desire to establish a new administrative system, the scholars who contradicted reality were deemed unworthy of existence. Thus, the House of Scholars was destroyed, and its inhabitants indeed began working. During the process of reclaiming their names and reconnecting with relatives, the illegitimate son of the tyrant was discovered. Yet, the question remained, why was he allowed to live at all? In a moment, she realized that there were still a few misguided individuals futilely attempting to uphold the tyrant's ideas and restore the former kingdom. Kalina aimed to expose them and eliminate them together with everyone else. Perhaps that's why the Count persistently sought to align himself with the Empress to remain undisturbed by the growing forces, in line with Kalina's vision. Upon careful consideration, it became apparent that aristocrats were gathering around him, literally clinging to the tyrant. Thus, it was fortunate that she avoided the encounter at that time. Clearly, it was evident that getting involved with him could lead to an unfavorable situation. Nevertheless, he continued to gaze at her with a look filled with despair. In a moment, the butler announced the arrival of the Empress, and it was decided to go and meet her. Ljubljana understood that, in any case, Her Majesty or someone else would handle the situation. The role of the Empress was not associated with beauty or capricious intrigues. Heroine only needed to find the suitable fiancé and return to the north. Yet, she disliked things that irritated, or at least that's what she thought before. On this night, in the garden, Ljubljana was fortunate to encounter them again. The unfamiliar woman once again ingratiated herself with the son of the tyrant. Therefore, it was decided to return and not even think about going out onto the streets, breathing fresh air. The lady asserted that she had no intention of releasing him. Clenching her fist, she delivered a forceful blow to his abdomen, declaring that this would be the day when she claimed him as her own. Louismin crumpled to the ground, and the lady insisted that she genuinely disliked witnessing pain on his exquisite countenance, hence, it must become hers. The stranger, with a maniacal smile, began to elucidate that he already knew collaboration with her family was crucial for the plan of Count Graham, not to mention that discussions about matrimony between their families were actively underway, so surrendering was the only prudent course. Suddenly, they heard rustling in the bushes behind them. Turning with trepidation, they beheld the Duchess. Feeling somewhat uncertain, she remarked that regardless of the urgency, engaging in such matters within the confines of the sacred garden was hardly appropriate. The current situation was vastly different from the past, and she was unsure whether she should extend assistance to him, notwithstanding his bloodied state. He, desperate, looked at the heroine and implored her to save him. The lady released the poor gentleman and greeted the Duchess. Introducing herself as Lysana from the Marquisate of Audle, she affirmed that, as one might have already noticed, she spent time with the person she loves, completely unaware of her presence, for which she humbly sought forgiveness. The heroine perfectly understood that the recent interjection by the assailant was a highly refined plea. It elegantly implored them not to interfere with their affairs and to depart forthwith. Such expectations were to be anticipated from a lady of noble lineage. In weaving this skillful falsehood, there was yet another layer. The Marquis concerning the tyrant, or rather, they remained staunch supporters of the royal family. In the Old Kingdom, the Marquisate of Audle had a long history. However, after the overthrow of the tyrant, they found themselves in a dire situation, forced into disgrace by being removed from central positions and experiencing a reduction in rank. The Marquis's influence was so potent that not even the tyrant could eliminate him. Rumors circulated that they had relocated from the capital. Hence, the Duchess believed she would harbor animosity towards the Old Kingdom. Yet, despite working with Count Graham to restore the Ainos royal family, even after 5 months since the fall of the kingdom, the Marquis Audle had not submitted. Kalina, however, was impressed by his resolve. She promised to restore his title and reclaim territories seized by the tyrant. In response, the Marquis Audle knelt and bowed his head before her, although their loyalty was not wholeheartedly pledged. During the success of the uprising, they had reached a temporary compromise. Lysana addressed the Duchess, requesting that no one be informed about their relationship, as they were still somewhat cautious and reserved, although in reality, she wished everyone knew about it sooner. The heroine was cognizant of the folly in it all, recognizing it as a unilateral aggression. Ljubljana turned to the assailant, asserting that, in her opinion, this gentleman did not share her viewpoint, and he confirmed it. However, Lysana disagreed and, addressing her victim, assured that due to his modesty, even the Duchess harbored doubts about their relationship. Louismond seized an opportune moment, skillfully extricating himself from the predicament, and sought refuge behind the Duchess. She observed from a distance that he appeared frail and slender, but upon closer inspection, his build was rather well constructed. Despite collapsing from the blow, possibly due to the element of surprise, this individual proved to be remarkably resilient. Lysana, however, was greatly perturbed by these actions. She concluded that the Duchess might be boasting about her betrothed running to her, but the proximity between them vexed her. The heroine requested an initial clarification of the situation, and suggested it would be better to continue this conversation during the day, yet tomorrow or any subsequent day. Until then, she was prepared to assist them in reaching their destination. Lysana saw that the composed demeanor with which the Duchess spoke, as if she held dominion here. Nevertheless, it was she who should be with him, and it was inconceivable that, in her place, this midnight interloper now presided. If cornered, she must yield, and thus the aristocrat asserted with uncertainty that she would never forget what the Duchess had done today. The heroine, in turn, requested to inform Felthurg Cadric if she erred in any way. Lysana interpreted this as a sign that the Duchesses had allied to suppress her. Perhaps Duke Felthurg was also aimed at her beloved. Consequently, she silently departed, entreating him to wait a bit longer in her thoughts. She vowed to rescue him from the clutches of these debauched dukes. Concluding this episode, Ljubljana wrested herself from the clutches of her victim, assuring that this was their farewell. However, Louismond, skeptical that she could simply depart, anxiously reached for her again, simultaneously beseeching her to marry him. Faced with such a proposition, the first thought that crossed the heroine's mind was that the man opposite had surely gone mad. However, Louismond also understood that she must now ponder why he suddenly declared such after their second encounter. Yet, there was no other way, and to survive this time, he needed to stay close to this woman. Now, he refused to succumb to death. Count Graham not only swore allegiance to the tyrant, but also offered his daughter. As a result, the world witnessed the illegitimate son of the tyrant and the blood relative of Count Louismond Fenlux Amel von Graham. It was expected that the Count's daughter would become the queen, but she was poisoned, and the first prince constantly threatened young Louismond with violence. Eventually, he chose the life of a libertine, as if the throne was unnecessary for his survival. All attempts at assassination orchestrated by the queen and the first prince were ultimately thwarted. Then came Kalina, who ordered the killing of all illegitimate children. It seemed that Louismond's short life had come to an end, but something went awry. He awoke, not understanding how it happened. He was sure he had been executed, but now he found himself back in the past. It was his chance, and the man had no intention of dying again. Therefore, survival was imperative at any cost. Even if pledging allegiance to the first prince, even if marrying a woman, the cycle could not be broken. Thus, Louismond felt his seventh death, and now lived his eighth life. Therefore, in his desperation, he sought refuge in the tower, entreating to be admitted, hopeful that by dedicating himself to learning, he might endure. As a last resort, he successfully secured seclusion within the abode of scholars, intending to devote himself to study until the end of his days. However, even this plan ultimately unraveled. The Empress displayed noticeable astonishment upon learning that Count Graham had a grandson who was fully aware of the predicament into which he had been thrust. Brought here as a hostage to the Empress, he never believed that she desired this herself. The eyes that met seemed to harbor intentions of killing him, risking the termination of his eighth life. Nevertheless, the man was convinced that he would survive, and thus he needed to find someone capable of protecting him. It had to be someone respected by the Empress, someone who could extract him from the clutches of Count Graham and Marquis Otto. Hence, the formidable Duchess Yeshlia was chosen. She was the only one who could serve as his savior. Therefore, Louismond now beseeched for 3 years of matrimony, stipulating that they would part ways immediately upon the expiration of this period. In any case, she needed to fulfill the blood oath she took during his seventh life, a vow he learned of, and decided to provide her with additional motivation. The gentleman avowed that finding suitable candidates was not as straightforward, and therefore, one should consider his proposal. He was well aware that the Duchess, too, harbored a desire for matrimony, making her a perfect match. However, things did not unfold as he anticipated. Instead, she unsheathed her sword, pressing it against his throat, inquiring whence he acquired such information. It appeared that the aristocrat was not inclined to jest, and with a frigid countenance, she inquired once more about the source of his knowledge. Yet, in his thoughts, Louismond already grasped that he might face death again, having barely survived 2 previous dukes. Now he would potentially meet his demise at her hands. Nevertheless, he no longer desired this fate. He wished to evade death. Suddenly, the man began to weep, and the heroine observed this. Therefore, she started probing into the cause, receiving the response that he felt deeply saddened to die in such a manner. She then reassured him that if he desired to live, honesty was imperative, his last chance to reveal the entire truth. At this moment, Louismond recalled his time in the House of Scholars, where one of them expounded on the notion that not every path may lead to an answer. The discovery of new paths is, in fact, part of science. Now he comprehended how correct the professor had been back then. If he couldn't find the answer on this path, he must create a new one, even if it meant accusing someone else. Therefore, the man declared that he heard this from his grandfather, who had planned betrayal. Yet, the heroine seemed unsurprised, so she inquired why, even if he heard it from the Count, he decided to propose to her. He then disclosed that it was for survival. As he revealed, Count Graham planned to betray the Empress. However, Louismond, devoted solely to the Empress, was uninterested in a ruined country, and aimed to avoid such events, hence his proposal. The Duchess affirmed her genuine need to discover a gentleman. However, he need not necessarily be entangled in any revolutionary endeavors. In this moment, he comprehended that this woman had dismissed all her suitors, and otherwise, one could not explain why, at her age, she remained unattached. Nevertheless, in his 6th existence, having perceived what might captivate her, he declared his capability to unveil all the intricacies of his grandfather's conspiracy. He pledged to strive for the happiness of their union, exhibiting utmost care and sincerity. He vowed to do everything to aid her, whatever she might request. When no response emanated from the gentleman, panic began to engulf his thoughts. Hence, Louismond declared that he would never fall in love with her. It resembled the narratives that heroines encountered in novels during her second life. In those tales, none of the protagonists rejected a proposal. Thus, the efficacy of this strategy should be absolute. Such were the terms of a contractual marriage. However, events unfolded differently than he anticipated, and such declarations only irked her. The Duchess understood that whether the betrothed harbored affection before marriage was not crucial. However, post-nuptials, the betrothed ought to be devoted to his wife. Louismond, having just asserted openly that he would be unfaithful, had crossed a line. Therefore, she directly inquired whether the gentleman had spoken of desiring another woman besides her even after the wedding. Yet, he assured her that this was not the case. He pledged unwavering devotion to his betrothed until the end of days, vowing not to share his bed with others. At this moment, the Duchess seemed to perceive that the man before her was serious, and moreover, she had no desire to bear extramarital children, much like herself. According to the blood oath, her firstborn must dedicate 20 years of their life in service to God. She desired the second child to become an heir, dedicating themselves to the empire and the empress for generations to come. However, the prospect of bearing children with an illegitimate son of a tyrant did not align with her plans. Yet, within 3 years, she could birth 2 children simultaneously and obtain a divorce, so there should be nothing dreadful in that. Observing him, the aristocrat appraised that merely considering his physique, he was unquestionably suitable, though rather lean. His chest appeared broad, and below the waist he seemed quite robust. If this was the case, there should be no issues with conceiving children. From this scrutiny, Louismond became uneasy and greatly perturbed. Consequently, he hesitantly apologized and then asked if she could refrain from staring at him in such a manner. At that moment, he realized how his voice trembled. In the capital, numerous feminine gazes were directed at him, but he felt disconcerted, particularly after she began scrutinizing him. The Duchess smiled. Then she sheathed her sword, declaring her acceptance of the proposal. Upon hearing these words, Louismond immediately rallied, assuring her that she could request anything, and he would do whatever she commanded. Ljubljana asserted that to scrutinize his resolve was not an overly challenging endeavor. Thus, he must present himself at her estate on the 3rd night to determine if they could conceive a child. Upon hearing these words, the betrothed once again blushed, as he failed to grasp the essence of the conversation. Consequently, he inquired whether the crux was not merely about entering into matrimony. The heroine elucidated that it was solely imperative to fulfill the vow, and she required offspring, more precisely 2. Therefore, he would need to come together with her and procreate a minimum of 2 children during the course of their marriage. Such was her condition. Thus, if he genuinely intended to marry her, they would meet in 3 days. The allotted time passed, and Ljubljana began to recollect her words. However, as anticipated, he did not appear. He seemed resolute at that time. She even dismissed all attendants earlier to ensure no interference. It appeared that the condition regarding children was indeed an unusual one. Even Felthur Cadric was surprised upon learning of it. Perhaps it was worth surrendering. Yet it was also possible to go in search of him. After a few minutes, a servant entered the room and conveyed that a black carriage had departed from the Marquisate of Audel, but returned to the Count. Action was imperative. Therefore, she decided that she must depart immediately. Stealthily approaching the estate of the Count, the heroine began pondering where to seek him. However, her reflections were interrupted by cries emanating from the 2nd floor. Ascending to the balcony, the Duchess commenced listening. There was Louismond, pleading to be released and expressing his opposition to it all. The heroine could already surmise what transpired there. The master of the house declared that his grandson would marry her sooner or later, leaving him no choice. Louismond, trembling with anger and disgust, affirmed that he had always believed the lady pursued him of her own accord. Yet, behind all this stood his grandfather. It seemed that the gentleman, driven by a fervent desire for power, was willing to trade him the sole remains of his own daughter. The gentleman appeared unaltered, incapable of change. Lasana then approached, entreating not to subject her to further anticipation of the inevitable. He resisted vehemently, and the grandfather declared that even if Louismond, despite being his grandson, stood in his way, he would not hesitate to dispatch him to a reunion with his mother. At this moment, the glass leading to the balcony shattered. Astonishingly, a figure entered. As all beheld the intruder, the host was seized by a peculiar gift of speechlessness. It was none other than the Duchess Yeshlian. Louismond, unable to find words, was simply offered a hand by the aristocrat, assuring him that she had come to rescue her betrothed. The gentleman could not recall if anyone had ever addressed him in such a manner throughout all 8 of his existences. At this juncture, the grandfather roused himself and began inquiring about the meaning of this, questioning the unexpected mention of matrimony with the Duchess. This was the first time he had heard of it, and the audacity of her intrusion into his estate without prior notice was unlawful. Following this, he commanded the servants to escort Louismond to his chamber. The Count surmised that she likely came entirely alone, and would scarcely manage to contend with his security unaided. After all, she was but a knight with a modest grasp of strategy. Her self-confidence stemmed solely from being the elder sister of the Empress, and nothing more. The servants cautiously approached, hoping to carry out the command. However, the Duchess appraised them and contemplated her next actions. They were ordinary individuals, and thus perhaps need not perish easily if merely struck. Louismond himself, deducing that he was apparently being left behind, instinctively grasped her hand. In an instant, he justified that he had not intended to do so, but acted out of sheer astonishment. It was then that she turned, knelt down, shielding him with her cloak, and assured that she had no intention to flee. It was only because he had seized her, and she had already declared her mission to rescue him. Observing all this, the gentleman realized that throughout his 7 past lives, he had never felt such warmth. On the 8th count, he finally encountered the first person who saved him from death. The heroine, witnessing his tremors of fear, wanted to understand the depth of his anguish. She had seen him only a few times, and each time, he was immersed in an unpleasant predicament. The servants, meanwhile, halted before them, hesitating to approach closer, and merely conveyed with uncertainty that the young gentleman would now be under their guardianship. However, the betrothed held a different opinion. Drawing her sword, she threatened that anyone who dared lay a hand on her betrothed must be prepared to become a sacrifice to the monsters. After these utterances, the dismayed attendants withdrew, and the Duchess aided him in rising. However, Louismond, unable to maintain equilibrium, commenced falling. Yet, in the 11th hour, the lady caught him, and they found themselves side by side. The aristocrat, catching herself in the thought that she hadn't immediately noticed, was surprised to find him tall, with a sufficiently muscular and robust physique. In an instant, the Count interjected once more, asserting that no one had the right to take Louismond against his own will. He emphasized that departure without the grandfather's permission was forbidden. The heroine inquired whether a man who had undergone the rite of passage into adulthood needed permission to leave the estate at his own discretion. The master confirmed, stating that this child belonged to this house and to him alone. Such a proclamation vexed the Duchess, prompting her to question whether his grandson was a mere chattel, an object subject to ownership. If so, she declared that Louismond, henceforth a part of the imperial family, would belong to Her Majesty. Although the Count dismissed it as absurd, the heroine persisted, asserting that he should be aware of the grave transgression he was committing by attempting to seize the property of the Empress. This might signify his desire for authority equal to that of the Empress. Though everyone understood the absurdity in the heroine's words, she continued to insist. She affirmed that estates, territories, and all who serve in the empire belonged to the Empress, questioning why she couldn't claim what rightfully belonged to her sister. The Earl refused to reconcile with this, opting instead to venture alone to retrieve it. In response, the Duchess emitted a vocal whistle, and at that very moment, a multitude of arrows penetrated through the windows, striking directly at the feet of the master. The lady assured him that her people were currently stationed outside, emphasizing the imperative need to eternally remember that her grandson is now affianced to her. Therefore, it would be unwise to engage in further folly. Upon his return, Louismond inquired whether all would be in order. His grandfather, by custom, could accuse him of grandiosity. According to norms, nobles had absolute entitlement to their own property and inheritance, as stipulated by imperial law. Consequently, she could be penalized for violating property rights. Thus, it would be preferable if she were to depart, but he couldn't articulate this, as doing so would undoubtedly leave him utterly alone. However, the heroine asserted that everything would be fine, and she would manage it. For now, it might be more beneficial to assist him in quelling the hiccups. Yet, the gentleman knew that there was nothing in the carriage that could aid him in this regard. Therefore, he resolved that assistance might be offered through a kiss. In past lives, he had done so numerous times, but this would be a first in this one. The lady affirmed that she would refrain from such actions if he objected. Yet he assured her that he harbored no objection whatsoever. At that very moment, a hand forcefully struck near his head, causing him considerable apprehension. He concluded that he had erred in some way, but in an instant, Ljubljana stepped back, asserting that everything had ceased. She added that one of her warriors had devoured a monster due to hiccups, and thus she found the sound displeasing. Suddenly, he recollected that the person before him, even though they were not yet wedded, had referred to him as her betrothed. He thought that rescuers would come for him, and hence, he hoped she would never regret her decision. He would not allow it to happen, so today itself, the conditions of their matrimony would be fulfilled. At the entrance, a lady-in-waiting awaited them, piercing both of them with her gaze as they crossed the threshold. Ljubljana surmised that the lady would retire if she left without forewarning. Yet things were not quite so. The servant asserted that, above all, a hot bath needed preparation, and thus, it would be prudent to follow her. Subsequently, Louismin found himself in the bath, relieved that it was all over. Perhaps now he could manage to live somehow. He had, after all, succeeded in arriving here, though he had been anxious until now. If one were to speak of the initial plan, he intended to appear before her as a representative from the House of Scholars, and commence discussing the future, pretending to envision it. In the end, however, he was shielded by something there. Having finished with the ablutions, the man contemplated what he should do next. Surely, he could captivate her with something, and gazing into the mirror, he realized that the primary reason he had to enter this abode today was not the time for mourning. A decision needed to be made somehow. Meanwhile, the Duchess consumed spirits, pondering the consequences of her decision, and how she would justify herself to Kalina. She could already envisage what it would lead to. After all, he was not just an ordinary man, but the flesh and blood of a tyrant. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and the lady reached for her sword. Then she remembered that she was no longer in the south, so she allowed entry. There stood Louismond in a robe, and the heroine simply wondered why he had come here. The gentleman elucidated his presence, stating that he was here to fulfill his duty. The heroine exerted all her strength to recollect what he meant. Once she recalled, she assured herself that everything was in order, and for now, it was permissible to rest. However, Louismond declared that he could accomplish it today, and expressed a desire to do so. Such an assertion amused the heroine. She did not quite comprehend how one could be so persistent. Blushing to the tips of her ears, it seemed that courage did not elude him. Additionally, he requested to be addressed as Louis henceforth. He was apprehensive that she might be having doubts now, even though not long ago, she had called him her man. Perhaps she regretted bringing him here. However, if they did not marry now, the threat of death loomed once again. Therefore, it was imperative not to let her regret her decision under any circumstances. No matter how, he must make her believe in him this night, and transform the union into life. Thus, he seized her and brought her to the ground. Ljubljana contemplated the prospect of tomorrow's visit to the palace, intending to convey all pertinent information. Suddenly, her designated betrothed drew near, attempting to bring her to the ground. Eventually, she found herself atop him, her arm twisted, prompting Louis to entreat her for release. His sudden proximity triggered reflexes within her, yet it seemed he was stronger than she had anticipated. Expecting a gentleness that was absent, she now felt the robust muscles. If his physique was such, even without training, he could become a proficient knight with the right efforts. Ultimately, Ljubljana relented, inquiring about his recent endeavor. In response, Louis wondered if this wasn't precisely what they should be engaged in. The Duchess was the first to suggest, and he decided to take matters into his own hands. However, it sounded too perilous, so the heroine affirmed that everything was in order. After a moment, he requested to be finally freed. The aristocrat then asked if he would retire to his chamber once released. Upon receiving a refusal, she seized his hands again, insisting that she could not let him go in such a case. Gazing at Louis now, the Duchess recalled that it was all as it had been the last time. That gaze, identical to the one he fixed upon her at the societal banquet, seemed to convey his unwavering resolve, his reasons, and why he was engaging in this act at all. At this moment, he once again addressed her, entreating to be released. The heroine observed that he seemed accustomed to such requests. This statement left Louis in a state of shock, and he promptly began to justify himself, as he did not wish to hear such sentiments from her. It was as if it were his first encounter with such words, intriguing the lady. Thus, she released him and pondered, catching herself entertaining the thought that, for some reason, she found solace in it. Louis, seizing the opportunity, decided not to squander it and kissed her. The disconcerted Duchess understood that she would hardly be able to do this with her current thoughts, but the gentleman assured her that a child must be conceived today. He gently led her to the bed, assuring her that he would take care of everything. In this scenario, the heroine acquiesced and accepted his proposal. Awakening in the morning, she beheld him beside her, realizing that he had indeed been with her. Someone else lay in bed with her for the first time. Despite having slept well, a peculiar fatigue lingered. Louismond suddenly embraced her, requesting her to wait a bit longer and indulge in more slumber. Most likely, he was speaking in his dreams, and upon waking, he probably wouldn't recall what he said. Nevertheless, she couldn't fathom being so elated just to gaze upon him. Upon awakening, the first sight that met his gaze was the scrutinizing gaze of the one with whom he had spent the night. The gentleman appeared quite drowsy, yet suddenly, he tenderly cradled her head and inquired about her night's rest. Rising from bed, they made their way to the bath. The Duchess observed Louis with interest as he busied himself. Opening a cabinet, he was pleased to find what he sought. However, Ljubljana attempted to discern what was on his mind, and he disclosed that it was his first time. Yet inexplicably, it had been pleasant. Meanwhile, Louis retrieved a vial and added something to the bath. Afterward, he lifted the heroine, apologizing, and gently placed her into the bath. She wanted to express her discontent, but there was simply no reason to. The right temperature, coupled with the harmony created by dried petals and essential oils. As he dried her, the gentleman asked her to inform him if anything troubled her. The Duchess affirmed that the water temperature was ideal, and it seemed he truly excelled in this. Louis remarked that the temperature was perfectly suited to alleviate fatigue, and he also knew where bath salts and perfumes were kept, making it effortless. He assured her that he used to be scolded frequently, but thanks to that, he swiftly honed his skills. This fact both intrigued and bothered her, as she couldn't fathom where exactly he could have acquired such expertise. Yet, her anger dissipated when she considered how much she enjoyed it. Although tempted to praise his proficiency, gazing at his countenance caused all anger to dissipate. Completing the ritual, they returned to the bed, where Louis began to towel dry her hair. At that moment, a lady-in-waiting knocked on the door, asserting the need to hurry and dine. Someone had arrived at the imperial palace, and a message had been relayed for them to make haste there as soon as possible. Due to the unexpected turn of events, Louis found his towel slipping away. Just as he was about to inquire about their next course of action, the Duchess thrust a morsel of bread into his mouth, insisting they hasten their repast. The lady-in-waiting had been informed that her ladyship would proceed to the palace immediately after breakfast, prompting the preparation of the carriage. Ljubljana perceived that if she was summoned to the palace, it seemed Kalina was already privy to the situation. Thus, she declared her intention to depart for the palace, advising him to stay behind for now. However, the gentleman seized her hand and inquired about her well-being. The heroine assured him that she would return as swiftly as possible. It was imperative to visit Kalina and assess the situation. Upon entering, the guards immediately recognized the enigmatic Duchess, and the atmosphere was as daunting as anticipated. Upon entering the room, she beheld the smiling Empress, who seemed genuinely pleased to see her elder sister. The Duchess extended polite greetings, prompting the ruler to dispense with formalities, given their private setting. However, Ljubljana insisted she could not dare to do so, understanding that Kalina was already well informed, having summoned her. Therefore, it was prudent to carefully choose her words. In response, the Empress, still smiling, inquired of her sister how she dared to act as she did a few days ago. It appeared there was a wealth of news, but all was well. Thus, honesty was the best policy, and curiosity sparked regarding what might disquiet her sister. Kalina, having discerned something to herself, instructed the maids to withdraw momentarily and bring 2 cups of tea. Presumably, her sister had something to convey. Left alone, the Empress affirmed that now there were only the 2 of them in this chamber, and she was prepared to hear everything. Later, after the entire narrative unfolded, it became evident that the Empress was already aware of everything. Nevertheless, she wanted to inquire herself. After ascertaining her sister's approval, she affirmed that she granted her endorsement. Such was the last thing the Duchess expected to witness, and observing Kalina's reaction, she inquired if her sister had not come here solely to announce the marriage. However, since no one intended to obstruct it, she could remain tranquil. Ljubljana could hardly believe that everything could be so straightforward. The younger sister had planned to leverage the tyrant's illegitimate son to lure and eliminate enemies. Yet, unexpectedly, Kalina added that neither she nor the other duchesses would be present at their wedding. As anticipated, the Empress had not betrayed her plans and had not altered them. Using this wedding, it seemed she intended to annihilate all dissenters together. Now, she simply informed them of her previous statements, so there was no need for sorrow. This implied that not only the Empress but also all the duchesses would refrain from attending the wedding. Once the engagement ceremony concluded, courtiers would be busy spreading rumors. People would say she was bewitched by the illegitimate son of the tyrant and quarreled with the Empress. No one should notice that this marriage was a sham. Most of all, she was troubled by the fact that at this rate, by the time the marital contract expired, he would be accused of treason and promptly executed. Therefore, it was imperative to find a way to avert this. The Duchess expressed her sincere regret for having disrupted plans and encountered difficulties. However, Kalina insisted that there was no need for apologies. In her elder sister, there had always been a weakness for handsome men. If it were not for this, she would have gone mad from the allure of beautiful exteriors. Despite the acknowledgement of her sister's scheming, the ruler, with a resolute knock on the table, declared that even with knowledge of her intentions, her sister chose him. A mere glance at his countenance left her convinced of her righteousness. Ljubljana indignantly implored not to ridicule her, as she was an empress, and, therefore, should conduct herself nobly. Pondering this, she inquired about her sister's opinion on how an empress should behave. Nobility was deemed irrelevant, as any action of hers was grand in the eyes of the empress. On this note, the heroine rose, affirming that it resonated deeply with her nature. Kalina requested at least to share breakfast with her, but the Duchess assured that she had eaten before arriving. The Empress declared that she would not accept any refusal. Her sister should not hasten to feed the beasts in the south. Having received another refusal, Kalina maliciously asserted that the Demon King had returned. In response, Ljubljana affirmed that she had no king who would slaughter his own people. However, she was succinctly informed that there was one, and at that moment, both of them fell into contemplation. After a moment, the Duchess declared that it was precisely why they killed him. Still, the Empress corrected her sister, asserting that it was she who had slain him. Later, as they bid farewell, a palace servant knocked on the door, informing that Duke Felthurg was still awaiting her. He had arrived at the palace before the Duchess, and thus, it was not advisable to keep him waiting for too long. She granted him permission to enter, and the man entered with great displeasure. Observing this, Kalina noted that he seemed to have a lot to convey to her. Drawing nearer, Felthurg seated himself, and Kalina apologized for making him wait. However, he tersely inquired whether she had given her blessing. The response, claiming her lack of understanding, infuriated him. He implored her not to feign ignorance, as he vehemently disagreed with allowing the illegitimate son of a tyrant to marry Duchess Yeshlian. Kalina elucidated that on one side, he was an invaluable and capable individual, devoted to the empire since its inception. On the other, he was the illegitimate child of a tyrant, a millennia-old mistake from the scholar's house. She questioned whether it was worthwhile to embrace and discard someone who represented nothing beyond their appearance. She added that it made no sense to cement the marriage of two out of the empire's 3 dukes. She then inquired if he intended to defy her will. In response, Felthurg clenched his fist so tightly that it bled, stating that he found it exceedingly difficult to restrain himself from causing a scene. Over the past few years, he had been searching for his distant relatives, driven by a desire to leave everything behind, including renouncing his title, all to win the Duchess's favor. However, he was prevented from doing so. The Empress asserted that it was because she had no intention of losing such a significant figure. He requested her to disclose the true reason. Despite the ruthless tyrant's slaughter of his family, he remained steadfast in guarding the border until the very end, for the sake of the people. Her sister mistakenly viewed him as someone who cast a favorable eye upon her, and therefore, he appeared to surrender. In reality, he yielded because he realized he faced a true traitor, one who would not make peace with the tyrant. If the uprising had failed, those who joined him would have been obliterated. From this, one could conclude that he was genuinely an honorable individual. Moreover, unwanted feelings sprouted within him for his subordinate, for whom he was willing to go to the ends of the earth. If, eventually, he marries her elder sister, he will remain devoted to her until the end of his days. Kalina elucidated her choice by expressing that she still harbors no hatred toward him for the injury he inflicted upon her elder sister. Although she knew about the loss of his eye, it would probably be prudent to explain everything more comprehensively. Pointing at him, the ruler inquired whether he was aware of how her sister struggled with a damaged shoulder. She could no longer use a bow, forcing her onto the perilous battlefield with a sword. While she suffered, he simply smiled and stood by her side. Despite Felthurg's assurances that everything was not so dire, the Empress insisted that, had it not been for that injury, the wound marred her sister's body. Now, he dared to wish for marriage with her, even after leaving so many scars on her body. The gentleman persisted in asserting that it was an honorable duel, and on that occasion, he paid the price, losing an eye at her hands. If he hadn't retaliated at that moment, he somewhat realized. The Duke inquired of the ruler whether she expected him to die that day. As the lady rose, she acknowledged that she understood it was self-defense. However, that is precisely why he cannot marry her. In response to the question of what he should have done then, Kalina bluntly stated that he should have died. Thus, he should understand why the Empress will never sanction this union. In that case, he inquired about the tyrant's son, as he merely uses the Duchess to save himself. Kalina retrieved a shawl from the drawer, claiming it was a gift her elder sister received on her 15th birthday. Although it was kept in the wardrobe, Kalina took it out several times, just to touch it. The shawl was so beautiful that she pleaded with her sister to give it to her, if her sister liked it. It was evident that Kalina also admired it greatly. Therefore, every time she saw the shawl, she begged her sister to give her the gift. However, her sister liked it so much that she dared not wear it, and hesitated to part with it at all. Her sister continued to refuse, and tensions rose when Kalina begged her. Eventually, she handed over the shawl, surrendering it without uttering a word. That was the kind of person she was. It seemed to imply that the son was like the shawl of no use to her sister. An attempt to evoke sympathy and steal her heart made no difference. In the end, if asked to kill him, her sister would do it. Feltherd concurred with this notion. Upon contemplation, the Empress never allowed him to confess or openly display affection for the Duchess. She always observed from afar, eliminating anyone who dared to approach her. Thus, he became curious whether this time she would merely sit idly by, given that she had been so thorough in her approach all this time. But now, she seemed to let everything flow on its own. There must be a reason for this, and the Empress confirmed, affirming that this is precisely what she likes in him. Returning, the heroine already knew that her sister planned to kill him in any case, so she became intrigued about whether she would manage to conceive from him by that time. Entering the room, she observed flustered maids searching everywhere for something or someone. Upon returning to the room, no one was there anymore. The maid apologized for momentarily being distracted. Ljubljana decided that his fiancé's feelings seemed to have vanished, and asked when he was last seen. The older woman explained that he was visited by a colleague who did not stay in the room for long. After that, the colleague, a bureaucrat of the empire who studied with him in the scholar's house, named Peony Lauren, recently granted the title of Baroness, left. They claimed to be close friends, which sounded truthful. It seemed that this time it was not Count Graham who stole it. So the Duchess inquired if they had searched the entire estate, and the maid confirmed this. She added that except for the western wing, as the maid warned him to refrain from venturing into that part of the hall, and he promised not to go there. Such a beautiful and dignified person surely would not break a promise. Descending there, they noticed the same handsome and dignified fiancé, who slept on the floor with scattered books. The heroine could not believe that the maid was indeed deceived by his beauty. Taking one of the books scattered on the floor, the maid explained that since he studied only science, perhaps such literature managed to captivate him. Therefore, the Duchess ordered to replenish her library with similar books. After that, the older woman inquired if their union was approved in the palace, and, receiving confirmation, asserted that they should marry as soon as possible. However, the Duchess assured that there was no need to rush. Ljubljana remained in the room as she did not wish to wake him, for he slept soundly enough. Still, his fiancé came home from work, but he was still asleep. To ensure that this carefree love lasted even more than 3 years, one needed to diligently strive to please the Empress. Since most important documents were in this study, she worried that problems might arise. However, she never imagined that someone would be sleeping so soundly there. In reality, the heroine was very angered when she thought he had left the estate. Contemplating upon that slumbering countenance, she pondered the question of the essence behind all this. Louis possessed neither force nor vigor, yet for some reason, the heroine was perturbed about him. A man who held nothing but fragile beauty. It seemed he felt secure in this place, and thus succumbed to a profound slumber. When brought from his grandfather's estate, he was greatly agitated and nervous. It appeared challenging to hold animosity towards the Duchess, as she was no longer a young and feeble maiden. Ultimately, she now had a husband, and he could be protected henceforth. The only current concern was his colleague named Peony Lauren. Despite scrutinizing his past, not a single woman was found with whom he had relations. This likely stemmed from her being his fellow scholar in the academy. Nevertheless, Louis insisted vehemently on a marital contract. Perhaps it indicated his readiness to depart after 3 years and elope with that woman. But what would befall them thereafter? A few hours ago, Louismond accused himself of being overly audacious, Though they had spent the night together, she appeared not disturbed but rather fatigued, as if something displeased her. Uttering no words, she departed for the imperial palace. Perhaps what she sought from him was not his physical presence. Suddenly, the lady-in-waiting opened the door and announced the arrival of Mistress Peony Lauren. She inquired about the necessary course of action, and Louis requested her admission, affirming that she was a renowned scholar from the House of Scholars. He believed that she, precisely, could provide him with answers. Upon seeing her, the gentleman moved to embrace her immediately. However, the scholar refrained from allowing it. Subsequently, they sat down for a cup of tea, and he grew curious about how they found him. She assured him that she got wind of it as she was heading to work this morning. Speaking of work, she informed him that she had secured official leave for him temporarily. She came not seeking gratitude, but because of the rumors circulating. Apparently, everyone at work today was speaking of him, as if Duchess Yeshlian was captivated by his beauty, and had abducted him from the hands of the Count, leading him to her estate. Louis asserted that it wasn't true, and Her Eminence had merely learned about his predicament and decided to assist. However, the scholar seemed disinterested and inquired about his plans regarding work. To this, the gentleman affirmed that he didn't anticipate being able to attend this week, and suggested conveying his apologies to the authorities. Understanding that he must endure this on his own, he acknowledged that he wouldn't leave this place in solitude. On this note, Peony declared that she had acquired all the necessary information and was ready to depart. However, before the doors, she paused and affirmed that it might not be her concern. Still, delving too deep for answers was unwarranted, for the truth was singular, though there were myriad ways to unveil it. In essence, she beseeched him to consult the professor. Louis pondered over these words and suddenly rose with great fervor. Seizing his companion's hands, he proclaimed her beauty and acknowledged her as the finest scholar. He had been digging so deeply when the answers lay on the surface. His knowledge, acquired from books in a past life, held the elusive clue. To survive his past lives, he delved into various novels: Cold Emperor, Hild Southern Archduke, Cursed Duke Reversal. Spending a night with the main heroine, they all became obsessed with her, filling the narrative with romance. Yet, he wondered if there were exceptions. There had to be, or else his chances of survival might plummet abruptly. However, in the end, nothing was found. They all inexplicably fell in love after the first night, as if those efforts proved insufficient. Nevertheless, Louismond indeed relished being in the company of the Duchess. He was unsure whether the possibility of being forsaken only after a single night had crossed her mind. Perhaps he had rushed into things too hastily. Upon reflection, she had not conveyed any information to the chief chambermaid. The man merely yearned for a concrete answer before embarking on the journey to the palace, yet the lingering sensation of anticipation. Louismond remained incredulous at what he witnessed. The Duchess Yeshlian, whom he had known, was not the same. She stood against his grandfather merely to save him, even shielding him with her cloak. It all seemed like madness, and he appeared to be the sole one here experiencing such sentiments. Upon opening his eyes, Louismond's gaze immediately fell upon the Empress, causing him initial consternation, as he did not comprehend her presence. A moment later, she elucidated that he had been in such a profound slumber that she dared not awaken him, even taking the liberty to shield him with her cloak. Subsequently, the heroine handed him a document, which happened to be the matrimonial contract he had previously desired. Nevertheless, she secured permission. Today, within the imperial palace, the Duchess received the Empress's blessing. Louis proposed the matrimonial contract to her, which suited her, though she initially intended to pilfer him from her sisters after these 3 years. The document contained comprehensive information regarding their marriage. Following a divorce, he would still be considered part of the Yeshlian Duchy. Even if he chose to marry again, his identity and status would remain untouched. Of course, alimony and pension would be dispersed. However, in return, throughout these 3 years, Louismond must remain faithful to the marriage, and cannot anticipate parental rights to any children. This might be perceived as heartless, but he himself proposed this 3-year contract. This clause was added to ensure that he could not later claim an inability to depart due to a child. The contract was crafted with the expectation that he would leave the estate without lingering sentiments for loved ones, and she would be grateful when the time comes. The Duchess requested a careful perusal of the document. Perhaps there was something he wished to amend or add. However, he had no intention of neither reading nor altering the document. Ljubljana then explained that it was a contract outlining the conditions that would constrain him, ones he must adhere to. The gentleman asserted that her luminosity would never allow provisions in the contract that would cause him discomfort, and thus he trusted her implicitly. This was to be expected. She bears responsibility for her words until the very end. The burden of the night he spent with her, she shouldered, making her his wife and him her man. The tranquility began to dissipate, but before his eyes everything blurred. And at that moment, Louismond lost consciousness. He was carried to the bedroom, where Ljubljana assessed his condition. His body had greatly weakened due to strain and fatigue. Regardless, it was challenging for his youthful body to endure so much, but he would swiftly recover with rest and care. She prepared a bath for him even as she slept on the floor, confident that he would be fine. It seems Louis had to go through a lot, living with the Count. He clung desperately to her, reminiscent of his sister from back then. Suddenly, the entire perspiring gentleman began to speak in his sleep. He pleaded to be saved, expressing his unwillingness to die. The heroine assured him that there was no need to worry, he wouldn't perish. She wouldn't allow it. She pledged to protect him at any cost. Later, Louismond began to regain consciousness, and the first thing he beheld was the familiar ceiling. By his side stood the Duchess. In his memory, the contract he received in the study was restored. It seemed she anticipated his awakening, though the reason for all she did for him remained unknown, putting in effort like no one else had, on that day, yesterday, and today. The gentleman approached her when suddenly Ljubljana inquired whether he had finished admiring the surroundings. Startled, he stepped back, and she reassured him that with such audible breaths and movements, he could easily be caught. If necessary, she could instruct on how to gracefully wake a sleeping person. Furthermore, if they were to marry soon, it would be better to address each other conveniently. She usually went by Luby, but the gentleman insisted on calling her Bia. In his past life, he heard Duke Felthurg address her this way just moments before Louis's head spun, because he dared to desire his wife. However, it was inconsequential now, and even if it cost him his life, she would be his Bia. The heroine affirmed that she liked it, and truth be told, she never liked the nickname Luby. But now it felt oddly embarrassing. Louis didn't know what to do. 3 years might not be a long time, but he wished to stay with her longer, perhaps even forever. He wanted to truly be with her. In that moment, he took her by the neck, and the Duchess responded in kind. Thus they kissed. 3 days have elapsed since Louis fell ill. Subsequent to this, his temperature sharply soared, prompting the doctor to deliver a lecture and insist on bed rest. Meanwhile, rumors proliferated like a snowball, among them the one claiming that she had fallen in love with the unlawfully born son of a tyrant, and spent all 3 nights with him in bed. However, it was far from the truth. In bed lay only Louismond, and the Duchess had not slept for 3 nights, due to a heap of work assigned to her by Kalina. Regardless of her efforts, it seemed like too much. It all culminated in her writing a letter, though it is unlikely to reach the recipient, as her sister might misconstrue it, thinking she doesn't want to work. Count Graham, suspecting that their relationship with the Empress was deteriorating, visited Kalina and began expressing his discontent. After all, they were all weary, and there was no need to succumb to emotions. As it turned out, the Empress sent the Count a document allowing their marriage. Nonetheless, the Duchess had to pay a substantial monetary compensation. In the end, countless rumors were left behind, and a bloody confrontation took place between her, Louismond, and his grandfather in the imperial palace. The room exuded a very tense atmosphere. The Count insisted that, despite the agreement, he opposed this marriage. He couldn't give away his dear Louis to the Duchess, even if he had to turn a blind eye. Ljubljana was already exhausted from all of this, but she couldn't bear to give away her husband. Hence, she expressed gratitude for raising him into an honorable person, and, reluctantly, granted permission for this marriage, gifting him a generous reward: a diamond mine in the west, and a salt mine in the north. All were aware that the diamond mine of Yeşilyan yielded the most substantial profit in the empire, not to mention the salt mine. The Count heard that the amount of extracted salt could cover the territories of several villages. She knew that the Empress had granted all this, and once rid of conspirators, all the property would become a national treasure, so there would be no issues in that regard. Suddenly, Louismond took her hand, assuring that it made no sense to relinquish so much to them, as he knew that this property would be used for rebellion. However, the heroine assured him that this was nonsense, and there was no need to worry. She knew exactly what he was concerned about, but everything would be fine because that's precisely what she was counting on. She endured numerous trials, Yet Kalina provided her only with crystal mines and places for salt extraction to the south. Therefore, these two locations can be exploited for rebellion, though it won't be a formidable force. It won't alter the course of the battle, and the villagers themselves won't be able to remove their spies from there. Observing how Louismond reproaches himself for this, the heroine realized that there was no need to apologize so profusely. There was a hidden agenda behind it all, and that's why it was done. Hence, the Duchess quietly instructed him to raise his head, as he was no longer subject to the Graham family. He needed to sit up straight and look at her. Finally, grandfather agreed, stating that if the Duchess loved him so much, then an old man like him shouldn't hinder the love of young people. It was necessary to forget all old grievances, and now solidify this friendship between the two families with a marriage. The elder man understood that if the rebellion succeeded, he could be called the king's grandfather. Even if it failed, the grandson could be used to hide in the shadow of the Yeschli-Dussel family. However, Louismond knew that his grandfather seemed content with the idea that selling him would bring power, and now only this man remained for him. Nevertheless, the heroine's assumptions proved accurate, and Count Graham was merely the tail of this resistance, not the body. If they genuinely wished to make Louismond their king, they would surely want to prevent this marriage. However, their goal is only the revival of the past kingdom, and Louismond is merely the one with a blood connection to the royal family. But for sufficient reward, they would gladly hand him over. All they awaited was to divide her and the Empress through this marriage. Done with formalities, the Count asked her to step out briefly, as they needed to talk with Louis. She had already taken enough care of him, but this was a family conversation, and thus they should be left alone. Louis also requested her to comply with Count Graham's request. Upon this plea, the old man became angry, but he immediately calmed down under the stern gaze of his daughter-in-law. Louismond assured him that he, too, had something to say to his grandfather, and so they were left alone. Finally, the Duchess decided to stroll through the palace, but suddenly encountered Felthurg Cadric, who wore a troubled expression. He promptly addressed her. It seemed that even with one eye, he saw her perfectly. Putting on a confident smile, she greeted him, but not receiving a response left her perplexed, as there was a possibility that she had again caused some trouble. After a brief pause, Felthurg noted that it seemed the conversation went well. The heroine affirmed this, assuring him that she had transferred ownership of the diamond mines and salt mountains. In response, he insinuated that she must be deeply in love if she had relinquished so much into his possession. The Duchess couldn't fathom the origin of such a reaction, as it wasn't someone from the lower class taking control of it. Yet, he inexplicably became sensitive to discussions about money. Curious about the issue, she inquired about the problem, and the Duke confirmed that it was an issue tearing him apart from within. She then proposed to resolve this problem for him. However, the gentleman assured her that if it could be resolved so easily, it would be good. It wouldn't be bad if, at least, she noticed it right now. Felthurg declared that there was something he had to do, and as much as he could help her, he would. However, she seemed entirely oblivious to his words and hints, not comprehending what it even meant. Yet, now they brought someone who grew up in poverty, from an undisclosed location. Observing as he articulated all this, the heroine discerned that it might be connected to Kalina. Pondering on it now, the Empress was focused on the construction of the Eastern Dam, a venture that annually consumed a substantial portion of the empire's wealth. The phrase "something that needs to be done" pertained to the Eastern Dam, and he would render all the necessary assistance, signified his desire to assume full responsibility. The fact that he dropped numerous hints about how he wished to help implied that Kalina had disregarded all his proposals. The unclear place seemed to refer to the residence of scholars, and someone who grew up in poverty pertained to seemingly avaricious officials who emerged from the scholar's abode. Now everything was falling into place. Yet the Duchess still couldn't comprehend why her sister had excluded Felthurg. After all, he was the duke with the most authority among the three duchies in the empire. He was deeply involved in imperial affairs, possessed loyal vassals, and had the support of the Western territory. His business continued to thrive. Could it be true that the ruler was indeed repelling him over such trivial matters? Nevertheless, it would have been better for her to marry him and gain more influence. It seemed that something had transpired between them, prompting the heroine to inquire directly about his thoughts on the matter. She was yet to comprehend fully, as she needed assurance before conveying this to her sister. Nonetheless, Cadric, with a firm resolve, affirmed that if it piqued his interest so, he would divulge everything. Suddenly, Felthurg drew near, as if an invisible thread connected them, and Louisemund emerged behind, positioning himself before her. The Duke merely smiled, curious about this unexpected occurrence. However, Louis assured that these were his intentions. Observing this, the heroine displayed noticeable astonishment. Her husband was not yielding to Cadric at present, and she was unfamiliar with the sight of him. Meanwhile, Louisemund loudly declared that he foresaw such a situation and urged Bia to keep her distance. Cadric, taken aback, inquired if Bia was her gentle name, and upon confirmation, slightly flustered, asked if it wasn't Luby. In response, Louis stated that it used to be so, but forbade him from addressing her by that name. The Duchess, at last, began to reassure her betrothed, assuring him that it was simply a misunderstanding. Seeing his tearful face, she embraced him tenderly. Felthurg, curious, questioned if she favored this pitiable puppy. She asserted that he was her future fiancé, and, therefore, wished him to be treated with respect. Ljubljana confirmed that the Empress had already bestowed her blessing upon them, and they had just concluded a discussion with the Count. She understood that Louis, shocked by the Duke, hadn't comprehended him fully, as he suddenly wanted to whisper something in her ear. Finally, Louisemund regained his composure and asserted that it was time to depart. Abruptly, he swept her into his arms, desiring to hasten their departure, so that the woman would no longer witness her surroundings. However, in that very moment, even more abruptly, she seized him by the throat. Felthurg was gratified that this reflex had not yet atrophied. When the heroine realized this, she immediately released her grip, apologized, and he now escorted her towards the exit. She was, of course, astonished that they would simply depart in such a manner. At this point, Louis resembled to her a jealous dog, walking away displeased. In this situation, Ljubljana declared that she would go first and extended an invitation to the Duke for the wedding. However, he seemed indifferent, and nonetheless, a gift would still be expected from him. Several weeks passed, and a letter from the ruler reached Duke Felthurg. It conveyed her surprise at his keen interest in the Eastern Dam. Her sister approached her, urging not to reject the Duke's assistance. Consequently, he was appointed as the chief overseer of that locale, and as a gesture of appreciation, she would cover the expenses for the construction of the waterway as a contribution on his behalf. In her private study, Ljubljana was engrossed in a discussion with Louisemund. From this moment onward, they began actively preparing for the upcoming nuptials, and the date would be designated by the imperial palace. The chief chambermaid will oversee all the arrangements, and therefore, he should not be concerned. The Duchess also proclaimed that her office was situated in the western part of the estate, while their bedroom was in the center. He could utilize the eastern section for his purposes. Listening to all this, Louisemund felt a familiar sensation. The professor in the House of Scholars was precisely the same. Even if he had slept for 20 hours the previous night, his mind still yearned for knowledge. At the conclusion of the narrative, the bride handed him a document, assuring that they could now formalize their union. Taking it, the betrothed began scrutinizing the missive. Despite having spent years in the House of Scholars, he was not foolish enough to sign a document without knowing its contents, but it would incur significant costs regardless of his sagacity. Having concluded with his signature, he returned the document, which the heroine entrusted to the head chambermaid, instructing to accept it as it is. Louis's personal budget should be made available for immediate use. The gentleman inquired whether it was truly intended for him, and upon glimpsing the sum displayed, questioned the veracity of it. There were numerous zeros, prompting the Duchess to inquire if it was insufficient. Hence, she proposed an adjustment, declaring that this sum would now suffice, but in the coming year, it would be doubled. Upon receiving this tidings, the man stood stupefied, remaining so until he retreated to his chamber. It was only there that he realized the splendid opportunity before him. With such a substantial sum, he could materialize his aspirations, specifically the plan to overthrow Duke Felthurg. Yet, in a moment of reflection, he acknowledged that the man troubled him too much. Consequently, the plan shifted to becoming a successful consort for the Duchess. Acquiring items poised for future popularity, supporting aspiring artists, and seizing the wealth amassed by Felthurg in his past lives, necessitated the purchase of a diamond mine and a salt mountain. Louisemund was prepared to dedicate all the diamonds of the world to his beloved Bia. Time elapsed, and the lady-in-waiting perused the imperial directives addressed to the Duchess, leaving her profoundly shocked. The communication stated that the wedding was scheduled in 3 weeks, leaving her unsure of how to proceed. In response, the mistress reassured her, advising that simplicity should guide her actions. The heroine desired a simple summons for the clergyman to facilitate the exchange of vows and rings. She would have promptly pursued this path if her chambermaid had not commissioned her wedding gown from the most renowned designer in the empire. Ultimately, in despair, the woman turned to the duchess, beseeching her to intercede with the empress to alter the date. However, the heroine assured her that such intervention was beyond her capacity, realizing that without this intervention, her sister would act out of spite, as this was not a genuine wedding, but merely a theatrical display of familial ties. She recognized the urgency to conclude matters swiftly. Nonetheless, there was nothing left to be accomplished. Upon learning of the impending date, Louis also became incensed by the abruptness of the wedding preparations in just 3 days. This reaction deeply moved the lady-in-waiting, as it contrasted sharply with the duchess, who displayed minimal interest in the wedding preparations. Contemplating the details, he proposed the utilization of lilies for the ceremony decorations, deeming them symbolic of family. To that end, he provided information on wholesale acquisition, emphasizing the avoidance of Graham family symbols. Suddenly, the head maid expressed her profound admiration for Louiseman, prompting the gentleman to reciprocate his enduring respect for her impeccable management of the estate. Surprisingly, the heroine noticed this interaction, bringing her joy as it seemed that they shared amicable relations. Thus, Louiseman oversaw all the preparations for the wedding, having witnessed countless weddings over his 8 lifetimes and having assisted in some. This marked his inaugural nuptial celebration, and furthermore, with his beloved, gazing upon the exquisite blossom cradled in his hand, he dreamt of being able to hold Ljubljana in a similar manner. Suddenly, the attendant exclaimed and gestured towards his hand, now stained with blood, due to his overly firm grip and a prickle-induced puncture. Despite all appearing well, an inexplicable unease lingered within him. Meanwhile, the Duchess was engrossed in documents, not only dispatching invitations to the distinguished, but also remaining by Louis's side. Invitations had been sent to both Duke Felthurg and Dominant. At that moment, a missive arrived from her southern territories, detailing an escalation in attacks. It inquired about her expected return. The lady-in-waiting wondered if she should contact them, yet the Duchess assured her that the time for her return had not yet arrived. Under the cover of the dark night, the heroine stealthily slipped out of the estate. Cloaked in darkness, she made her way to the tavern, where people fervently discussed their forthcoming nuptials, imbibing spirits. One of them decided to propose a wager on who would wear the gown at Duchess Yeshlian's wedding. However, all bets were placed on Louiseman, leaving the proprietor astonished and assuring that in such a case, no bet would be honored. Subsequently, the proprietor turned to the heroine, who was sipping her ale, inquiring if she wished to partake in the wager. Poking her glass, he asserted that if she made a wager here, she would assuredly win 100-fold more. Intrigued by the proposition, she contemplated it, and the gentleman vowed that if the guest emerged victorious, he would sell the establishment and pay out 100-fold. Suddenly, behind her, a mysterious figure questioned the gentleman's certainty in his words. The host was offended by this disrespect, but when a gold coin fell into the glass, all present were deeply shocked. Sighing heavily, the heroine, under the guise, inquired of the figure about the purpose of these eccentric antics. After taking hold of them, she led them onto the street, assertively stating that every time this young scoundrel spoke without permission, it inexplicably ceased to be bothersome. Once on the street, she questioned the attire he wore, and the mysterious figure revealed themselves to be Lou Dante, Duke Dominant. He claimed that she herself instructed him to conceal his visage and arrive in such a manner. However, it was pointed out that merely obscuring the face was insufficient, and there was no necessity to meet and drink in this place. It was time to depart to a quieter venue. Suddenly, Lou Dante inquired if they could be left without repercussions. At that moment, several inebriated individuals, armed with weapons, approached, insisting that they should flee until their elder brother departed. It seemed they were after money, yet violence was not their intention. It was sufficient to part with their possessions. Meanwhile, the man also unsheathed his sword, prepared to swiftly conclude the matter. However, the Duchess, sighing heavily, implored for a resolution without bloodshed. Lou Dante, with genuine incomprehension, questioned why, intriguing the heroine. He queried why they couldn't ruthlessly dispatch these individuals. Consequently, she asserted that as she was entering into matrimony, a curse would be cast upon them, disrupting their familial harmony. The intoxicated assailants, oblivious to the unfolding gravity, decided they were being played with and assured that, in that case, they would handle everything themselves. Ljubljana, in the meantime, began contemplating the night stars, reveling in the tranquil sky, acknowledging that she did not wish to witness such a sordid spectacle. In a moment, Ludante stood amidst a group of unconscious bodies, for which he received gratitude from Duke Dominant. Ludante, the youngest among the dukes supporting the empire, possessed incredibly formidable abilities, being the finest knight in the entire realm. Now, he beseeched her to don the wedding gown, so that he could earn his keep. Despite his handsome exterior, within him harbored a desire for naught but blood. The Duchess, with indignation, asserted that even if she were to attire herself, it would certainly not be for him. Yet, she found herself intrigued as to why he was present. In response, the Duke affirmed his regret for being unable to attend the wedding, and expressed his intention to present a wedding gift. Specifically, the man wished to provide her with information essential for the success of the wedding. Ljubljana, with a cavalier attitude, suggested that he seemed to want to cheer himself up with such words. However, it appeared that the Duke was earnest. He assured that harboring such thoughts could lead to complications, emphasizing the genuine value of the information. The way he approached disconcerted her, and her hand reflexively neared the sword. It was a familiar sensation, as if the blade's edge were at her throat. Whenever the Duke drew near, this feeling surfaced, akin to her encounters with Cadric. It wasn't merely because he was a superior knight, but rather, the sensation sent shivers down her spine. Earlier, she had the occasion to converse with Felthurg, and he requested her not to draw close to Ludante. To this, the heroine affirmed that even if he had but one eye, he ought to look straight ahead. The Duke was attached to her, undoubtedly because she was the sister of Her Majesty, and could influence matters regarding the wedding. In any case, he was merely squandering his time on it, and therefore, it was not worth her effort. Meanwhile, Ludante noticed how the Duchess's hand reached for her sword, prompting a smile from him. Ljubljana, perceiving and thought that he seemed to derive pleasure from watching her nervousness, as if that was what he had in mind. Considering that such an exceptional knight as him was approaching her, it was only natural that she would be cautious. Yet, if she were to cause any trouble, she could be slain, hence the nervousness. Drawing nearer, Ludante declared that insurgents were targeting her wedding, and this news shocked her. It seemed they intended to disrupt the wedding and steal Louismond. However, it was more than just the Duchess Yeshlian's wedding. The entire empire's attention would be riveted to the event, and she would be vulnerable. Nevertheless, she had to inquire whether the Duke was certain about this information. In such a radical move, he nonchalantly assured her not to perceive it so seriously. It appeared that an extremist had emerged among the insurgents, prompting the heroine to add that it would likely involve Marquis Otto, who couldn't allow his forces to split. However, Ludante, proposing a third scenario, suggested that imminently an entirely different force could emerge, a second group of insurgents harboring dreams of restoring the Old Kingdom. Perhaps this might sound fantastical, considering the inexplicability of restoring what has long been in ruins. The kingdom lay in ruins in a rather unfavorable condition. Nevertheless, the empire is a fledgling nation, founded less than a decade ago. It is understandable that people might feel unsettled, clinging to old memories, yearning to revert to the familiar. In this situation, it remained uncertain whether it was even prudent to feign strained relations with the Empress due to the man. Kalina, unlikely to be so absurd in such a circumstance, might have posed a reason not to jeopardize exposing everyone to danger to eliminate all the insurgents. Meanwhile, Ludante circled merrily around the Duchess, intrigued by the expression on her face. Whether it was due to the upcoming wedding or perhaps a disapproving look directed at him, she disliked that she had a betrothed who was the illegitimate son of a tyrant. After the plea for silence, the Duke assured her that she was once again entertaining nonsense. She adopted a solemn demeanor only when it concerned Her Majesty. Among the three of them, he was the closest to her and, therefore, the one to voice that her anxieties about the ruler were baseless, and it wasn't worth taking them so seriously. Nevertheless, among the three, he thought he would be the first to marry, and the heroine would be the last. However, something went awry. He also asserted that for the stability of the empire, Kalina must promptly find a husband and firmly establish an heir. He was confident that he would marry as soon as the empire emerged. It seemed he didn't doubt that he would be the chosen partner for the Empress. Consequently, the heroine insisted that Duke Felthor could be the first, acknowledging that he would be a better match. However, Ludante merely chuckled at this, claiming it was a good jest. Ljubljana, unappreciative of this, declared that having seen him laugh just now, she was determined to push Kadrik forward. Despite his assurances that he had done something for the wedding, she insisted it was a wedding gift, and there was no need to attach further conditions to it. In such an instance, the Duke proposed to serve as a protector for her husband. The heroine failed to comprehend the rationale, asserting her ability to defend him on her own. Ludante pointed out that she isn't always in the capital, and questioned whether she even intends to remove this ruffian from the scholars' abode in the south. Realizing that she indeed planned to take him along, the gentleman assured that, in any case, she couldn't be by his side throughout the day. While in the capital, no one could safeguard the Duke's betrothed better than he. He was, indeed, the head of the entire empire's intelligence, and it would be prudent to protect Louis with the assistance of Ludante, who had the imperial guard. However, the heroine declined, affirming that the position beside the empress is not something she would trade. Even if Kalina were to choose a guardian or a palace gardener as her betrothed, the sister would gladly support her decision, trusting in her discernment. However, if it turns out to be someone peculiar, they could handle it without the empress's knowledge. Deprived of the necessary support, the Duke turned away, stating that it wasn't worth disclosing all of this. Nonetheless, in the end, the heroine inquired if Kalina was aware of all this. Ludante remarked that they should be close sisters, exchanging thoughts, and she could handle it herself. Later, upon her arrival in the capital, there was an occasion when she encountered Ludante at a grand ball. It then piqued his curiosity why she had been restless lately. She could quietly remain in the Duke's abode, as it became uncomfortable to constantly cross paths. To this, she asserted that she sought a suitor worthy of her. In this circumstance, the Duchess requested that if he came across a decent person within his informational network, he could introduce them to her. Ludante, however, insisted that it wasn't that simple. Yet, if circumstances led him to aspire to become the consort of the Empress, everything could change. Ljubljana showed no further interest and silently prepared to depart. The Duke inquired whether it was because of him. Her standards had risen, making it likely to be challenging to find someone deserving. However, if unsuccessful, she could always turn to him, and he would assist in that. But this was contingent on her becoming empress. After all, he wouldn't settle for anything less than the best, and as he deemed himself the finest, his partner should match that the best woman, the best position. That's where he belonged. Eventually, they concurred that Ljubljana was too indolent for such aspirations. Nevertheless, if she were to attend an audience, it would be prudent to commend him more. It was then that the heroine realized this young man was absolutely not what she needed. The Duchess returned by morning the next day, and waiting for her was the lady-in-waiting, inquiring where she had been. The heroine assured her that she had simply woken up early, and thought a stroll would be pleasant. It was then reminded to her that today was the day for fitting the wedding gown. Upon hearing this, the aristocrat inquired whether she would be wearing a gown at this wedding. From such a question, all the present servants were shocked, but after a moment, they began to whisper among themselves, asserting they were correct in wagering their entire salary on it. However, the stern gaze of the lady-in-waiting immediately quelled them. The elder woman asked if such peculiar thoughts had arisen in her, not because she heard gossip about herself. But the heroine chose not to respond. Then Louis, who was descending the stairs, addressed her, asking if she had slept well, as he had a splendid rest. However, his drowsy appearance revealed otherwise, and Ljubljana decided that it might be because she hadn't slept with him. Urgent matters led her to sleep separately, choosing instead to meet with Ludante. Seated at the breakfast table, the betrothed inquired about the urgent matter she had yesterday. As she seemed quite unsettled, he began to worry even if she returned late. A good night's sleep was essential, certainly not because he hadn't slept, and he eagerly anticipated her. He enjoyed a sound sleep, and he wouldn't notice if someone lay beside him. He simply wanted everyone to know. Such deception was immediately exposed. Yet the Duchess managed to feign belief. She asserted that an increased workload had been placed upon her recently, and while documents were being scrutinized, the day elapsed. Hence, it was fortunate that he didn't wait for her. Concluding her meal, the senior chambermaid assured her that the gown designer awaited her in the reception room. Upon entering, The heroine instructed the woman to assist Louis, while she, adorned in her ceremonial attire, would manage on her own. The chambermaid insisted that he could handle it himself, and her assistance was indeed required by the Duchess. The heroine insisted that if the betrothed were to see the bride's attire before the wedding, it would bring misfortune. Frulina, being too close to him, needed to exercise caution. Inside the room, to her surprise, no one was present. However, upon closer inspection, the household staff was discovered hiding in the corner, quietly weeping. When their eyes met, they inquired about their fate. They pleaded to be spared and promised to do anything. These last words intrigued her. In due course, they compassed themselves and gathered around the table to discuss everything. The designer, now reassured, comprehended that the Duchess did not appear as dreadful and fearsome as the gossip suggested. It was now appropriate to show respect to such a person. To lighten the atmosphere, the designer remarked on the exquisite weather today. Suddenly, a lightning bolt illuminated the room, foretelling rain. In response, the Duchess observed that she hadn't anticipated enjoying such weather. In such conditions, garments get soaked, and tailors may not appreciate it. However, while discussing this, the heroine unconsciously struck a very graceful pose, causing the designer and her assistants to blush deeply. After a moment, the Duchess indicated that they could begin presenting the options. The designer handed over an album, assuring that everything had already been settled, and one could simply choose a design. It could be a classic and elegant design. Presently, vibrant styles were also in vogue, yet one could opt for something daring. After scrutinizing everything for a while, Ljubljana asserted that, in her opinion, they were all practically the same. However, in the next moment, she added that she meant they all looked beautiful. And since they were all beautiful, she would prefer one where the width of the skirt, even when voluminous, wouldn't appear peculiar. Eventually, they presented the gown in which the skirt could be expanded. Observing it, the heroine desired to inflate it even more, displaying it to the extent required. The Duchess added that she would prefer if they utilized something to prevent the gown from appearing overly cumbersome, emphasizing against making the skirt multilayered. The renowned designer contemplated for a while if this could be possible. After a brief moment, she joyfully declared that such an approach could work for them. However, she was uncertain whether a lady of such nobility would appreciate expanding the skirt. Commoners used dense paper. The effect lasted only half a day, but the dress would be exceptionally lightweight. Ljubljana appreciated this option, and after some adjustments, they selected the desired design. Subsequently, the Duchess also requested to keep this a secret from Fraulein. If the bridal gown is seen before the ceremony, it may jeopardize the happiness of the marriage. The designer perceived this as a threat and fell to her knees, pledging to keep the secret to her grave. Meanwhile, the senior maid went to Louismond, who had already tried on his suit. Having experienced 8 lives and adorned many outfits, he precisely knew which design suited him best. He inquired about the Duchess's progress, to which the woman assured him that the lady wanted to handle everything herself. Additionally, Fraulein informed that a physician had arrived, prompting the gentleman to promptly proceed for his examination. At its conclusion, the doctor assured him of his complete health, after which he extended a vial, instantly recognized by Louis. Since learning that Louismond would be the Duchess's gentleman, the physician wished to bestow this upon him. Anticipating a swoon from the depletion of masculine vigor, he felt a genuine pity for the young man, and swiftly departed the room after handing it over, avoiding unnecessary complications. Louis, sighing heavily, acknowledged that throughout his 8 lives, he had never required such remedies. Consequently, he handed it over to his aide, who was elated. The gentleman knew that if he desired to have children, he shouldn't consume just anything. He must have 2 children within 3 years. Thus preparations needed to commence. He regarded children as endearingly sweet, and wished for his firstborn to be a girl resembling Bia, with red hair and captivating eye color. He was confident that his daughter would be as lovely and enchanting as her mother. As a father, he intended to take charge of their upbringing. Though aristocrats usually entrusted the upbringing of their children to a nanny, as a father, he wished to undertake this responsibility himself. Louismond reveled in the prospect of finally having a family, not one that regarded him as a mere instrument to secure power, but a genuine family, a happiness he hadn't even dreamed of in past lives. Ultimately, it had fallen into his hands. Yet, even in this happiness, there is an expiration date. Presently, the only thing one could trust was the book, for within its pages lay the path, much like in this novel. He knew that if he continued to present himself in a favorable light, perhaps Bia would fall in love with him. In 3 years, she might dissolve the contract. However, currently, he was curious if she was still occupied, and when she arrives, it would be good if she spent the night not in the office but in the bedroom. If only she knew how cold it felt in the bedroom without her. Fortunately, she would never experience such a sensation. The most crucial thing the bride-to-be must do before the wedding, the top priority for women with attractive gentlemen, is to care for the other women around them. That's precisely why she arrived at the imperial palace, where it seemed Louis's lover worked. There, she encountered a woman who served as the Minister of Internal Affairs. She appeared visibly fatigued. The heroine had heard about her extensive workload due to the project preparation in the East, and the minister confirmed it. She pleaded to be rescued or allowed to resign altogether. However, the Duchess assured her that the Empress guaranteed an excellent pension, which only plunged her into greater despair. Entering the study, the aristocrat inquired about the whereabouts of Peony Lauren. The engineer conveyed that she had been summoned by the Duke for a personal conversation, but assured that she would return shortly, making it acceptable to await her presence in the room. The Duchess inquired if the engineer had contemplated the idea of hiring more personnel for the work. The engineer assured that recruitment was also a challenging task. Nevertheless, she expressed gratitude that the ruler had not dismantled the House of Scholars entirely. Without the current staff volume, matters would have been even more dire. It was precisely due to this that Kalina had preserved the House of Scholars. The heroine inquired about the well-being of her husband. The engineer affirmed that he appeared to be alive, discounting rumors of his demise due to overwork. She hoped that he had not acted treacherously or fled on his own. In her perspective, if one were to face mortality, it should be done together. No one could replace the head accountant, and if he were to perish, she emphasized that he should do so together. With this, she departed, assuring that she would bring Peony Lauren as soon as she returned. Finally, Peony Lauren appeared, and right from the threshold, she introduced herself as the secretary of the Bureau of Internal Affairs. The heroine privately observed that the secretary managed her responsibilities exceptionally well, seemingly possessing a fine character. However, the Duchess had come to meet the woman her future husband admired. The initial impression was not unfavorable, and therefore, they seated themselves at the table. Ljubljana felt a bit uneasy under the curious gaze of her rival. The woman before her appeared strangely content, looking at the Duchess. Apparently, she had not anticipated being summoned through Louis's mind. The expression on her face seemed to indicate a mixture of excitement, as if some distant director had called her for a discussion. There was an evident distinction between the public and the personal, even for a simple secretary who, knowing she was in the presence of a duchess, remained thoroughly composed. Somewhat reassured, the heroine initiated a conversation regarding Peony's role. With a joyful countenance, Peony expressed her gratitude for the opportunity to share her work. She was currently preparing for a road renovation project west of the capital. The waterway was also undergoing repairs, and the road was being paved with bricks. Hearing this, the heroine noted Peony's calm explanation, as if she had prepared meticulously and was exceptionally astute. Meanwhile, the secretary continued her exposition. What truly stirred her and held the utmost priority was the maintenance of waterways. The Duchess inquired if she would consider participating in a project involving the eastern water routes. This way, she could apply her acquired knowledge in her current role of waterway repairs. It appeared that the secretary harbored ambitions and possessed a coveted talent. The Duchess even contemplated bringing her along to the southern region. However, enticing her southward in such circumstances would undoubtedly make her view it as a dismissal. Therefore, the heroine remarked that the Eastern Water Conservation Project seemed to captivate her interest. With evident satisfaction, Peony Lauren affirmed this, asserting that, historically, rulers of a new generation must engage in such endeavors. They spoke as if it were for the enhancement of production, but it also served to strengthen their dominion in a vast enterprise. Now, Ljubljana realized why her sister was pushing forward with this project. It seemed that all decisions of the current ruler were judicious. Peony Lauren, curious about why the Duchess had come to meet her, wondered if there were significant intentions. It was a great honor for her that the Duchess had noticed a humble secretary like herself. Hence, she would like to believe that she would be utilized for some grand purposes. In truth, the Duchess desired to behold the countenance of her husband's beloved. However, broaching the subject now felt somewhat awkward. Hence, the heroine tentatively affirmed the secretary's conjecture, causing her to rise from her seat in a mix of happiness and embarrassment. She reassured that she indeed knew that diligent effort would inevitably garner notice. Ljubljana inquired whether this was as beneficial as it seemed, as many thought to humble themselves and depart from the East, given the prevailing aversion towards it. Contrarily, Peony Lauren, with a gleam in her eyes, declared herself a specialist in history. Thankfully, she had lived to witness the unfolding of a new chapter in her life. She could not merely observe from the sidelines, but actively participate in the project, potentially becoming the focal point of this narrative. Prompted by this, arose the question of whether her scholarly background and the limited scope of her bookish pursuits might pose a challenge. The secretary affirmed that both mental acuity and physical strength were requisite for learning. In the scholar's abode, a placard above the dining hall entrance always bore the inscription, "A healthy body hosts a healthy mind." It was then that the heroine comprehended that perhaps Louis's physique had been a result of this philosophy. Thus, she assured that she would discuss it with Duke Felthur Cadric, responsible for this aspect. Ljubljana acknowledged that if Peony found it burdensome post their wedding, she intended to promise them the liberty to leave the country after 3 years. Nevertheless, this maiden displayed greater fortitude than anticipated. If she worked with such motivation, promotion would come swiftly. Louismond and she would need to depart this land as swiftly as possible, before the insurgents claimed him. The Duchess was also curious whether the secretary would exchange her talents and ambitions for love. As for herself, she could not conceive of doing so to attain Louis. She could not sacrifice anything. Nonetheless, she lost nearly 3 years, and after that, Louis' mind would return to this woman. Upon returning, the Duchess's first inquiry was about the whereabouts of her betrothed. The maids informed her that he was in his chamber, and despite the doctor's visit, he had not emerged since. The heroine thought he must be thoroughly fatigued from the preparations for the wedding, and hence, she requested not to disturb him. Let him rest well. As she prepared to go to her study, a maid hesitantly inquired if it might be better for her to pay him a visit. However, the Duchess couldn't fathom the purpose of this, as it would only disrupt his repose. The maid reassured her that the master would not consider her an interference if she came. Ljubljana disliked the way they spoke, as if they knew him better than she did. However, observing their trembling, it was evident that it was due to fear. Thus, the heroine was impressed by their boldness and inquired why they thought so. It was then revealed that Louismond could not sleep at all last night, anticipating the Duchess's return. Therefore, they continued to bring him candles until dawn. As the maid spoke, tears welled up, assuring that he might be waiting for her even now. Hence, it was unwise to leave him. Their tears were shed out of concern for him. The heroine involuntarily noticed other servants, who, in fear, hurried to summon the head maid to rescue the young ones. When the maid had calmed herself a bit, she looked ahead, where the Duchess sat on the stairs, gazing intently at the chambermaid. This filled the young servant with fear, and after inquiring whether she had shed enough tears, the young maid began to tremble with fear. Nevertheless, the Duchess asked her to answer some questions first and then cry, as the head maid would soon arrive to rescue them. She needed to escape before her arrival. In that moment, she unintentionally struck a pose that immediately calmed the maids, as if they were enchanted. Seizing this moment, the lady asked her to tell what sad event had transpired. Now, with a resolute demeanor, the maids began to explain that Louismond was doing everything possible for the Duchess in this household. It was disheartening that she failed to notice anything. It seemed he loved the lady very much, so they implored her to allocate more of her time to him. Such a request surprised the heroine. Maids who were recently trembling in fear of her were now making such pleas. Therefore, they were asked whether they liked him. The maids informed that he was very kind and knowledgeable. There was nothing he didn't know, and he always worried about the Duchess. Every day, he checked how much alcohol she had consumed. He pre-instructed the chef on what to prepare for the next morning. When the head maid presented the estate budget for the next month, he found errors in the document. Moreover, he personally chose and ironed the shirt she was wearing today, reminiscent of Louis. Ljubljana failed to comprehend since when he took charge of all this. As she listened, it seemed that the gentleman underwent a profound transformation. He became more gentle and ceased to wear a frown, which left her feeling oddly unsettled. In the Duchy of Yeschlian, there is no lord, the estate is vast, teeming with people. Yet governance held no interest for her. Thus all affairs were managed by the head chambermaid. In other words, she placed complete trust in Mrs. Lemons, and though the latter requested her to harbor at least a modicum of doubt, the Duchess cavalierly asserted that it would be an act of betrayal. Hence, she would always entrust all her estate matters to her. Ultimately, Ljubljana desired to marry Louismond. However, given the contractual nature of their union for 3 years, she hesitated to entrust the management of the estate to him. Yet, unexpectedly, the gentleman earned the respect of the staff and assumed the role of the master of the house imperceptible to her. There was no corner left untouched by his influence. The ambience of the estate underwent a transformation, and even the chambermaid initiated a conversation with her. The staff used to fear her, always succumbing to dread at the sight of the stern Mrs. Lemons. However, Louis adapted the place for comfortable living. Whether their marriage was a sham or not, they did indeed marry, and for some reason, her heart beat strangely. The chambermaids persisted in entreating not to treat the gentleman harshly, lest he might escape to some other place. Eventually, the heroine acquiesced to their pleas and proceeded to her betrothed. They were immensely delighted and grateful for her decision. Upon entering the room, she knew he ought to be there. However, she observed him sleeping at the table on some tome, seemingly exhausted from overseeing the estate. Then he affirmed that he would never love her. With these words, a proposal of hand and heart was made, leaving the Duchess unsure if it was advantageous to have such a hypocritical gentleman who made people's hearts tremble. If this continues, she might not wish to release him. Some time passed, and the wedding day arrived. As the aristocrat was adorned, a designer arrived, assuring assistance in donning the gown. Miss Lemons, upon seeing the Duchess in her dress, was deeply moved by its exquisite craftsmanship. However, in a moment, she noticed something peculiar. When questioned, Mrs. assured it was a secret, dispelling the entire enchantment. Yet the gown remained resplendent. Eventually, Ljubljana observed that, for the first time in a long while, she adorned herself in a gown. Everyone around praised her, causing the heroine to feel a bit embarrassed. Nevertheless, she understood it was wiser not to boast, but to envision the countenance of her future gentleman. Therefore, she desired a brief respite before the ceremony. However, the designer declared that if she reclined, it would ruin the hairstyle, and if she sat, the dress would wrinkle. This clearly did not appeal to her. The moment arrived when guests began to enter the terrace, where the ceremony was soon to commence. The surroundings were captivated by the embellishments, with some asserting that they had never seen such a splendid venue before. The fragrance of lilies seemed omnipresent. And now, it was time for the betrothed to make their entrance. When the attendees saw them, their initial sorrow was that the Duchess of Yeslien had indeed put on a gown, causing them to lose a wager. However, even more people were moved to tears by the beauty of the couple. The bride silently gazed at her gentleman, realizing he was an incredible beauty. His splendor and sanctity made her heart tremble. Suddenly, tears welled up in his eyes, prompting the Duchess to inquire about the cause. However, he simply couldn't fathom how exceptionally beautiful she was. In her ivory gown, she resembled an angel descended from the heavens. However, Ljubljana had drawn different conclusions in her mind. She believed that at this very moment, he was regretting his union with her. In reality, she had given him ample chances to escape. Yet it was Louismond's choice to remain by her side. Now, she had no intention of releasing him. For the next 3 years, this gentleman would be hers. In 3 years' time, the heroine planned to return him to his lover. However, provoking people to this extent was already excessive. If he intended to regret it, he should have done so earlier, and now he had nowhere else to go. All those present were greatly unsettled by this peculiar gaze. Ljubljana resolved that she probably did not wish to don this gown, and, out of anger, she might harm one of the guests. With the same look, she asked her betrothed not to cry, for today was a very good day. Observing her now, Louis noticed that she considered their wedding a beautiful and extraordinary day, despite him advising her not to wear a wedding dress, as she looked very beautiful without it. It was fortunate that Duke Felthurg was not present. However, the Duchess's thoughts differed. She believed he had arranged everything for his benefit, including all the people in her estate. Now he cried not wanting to marry, which, although senseless, she could not stomach this marriage, and had no intention of holding on to it. The attending guests, witnessing this scene, were convinced that Louis had indeed been coerced into this marriage. That was the reason for his tears at the altar. They asserted that the Duchess had fallen completely in love with him, even infiltrating Count Graham's house. Consequently, not even the Empress and the Dukes attended the ceremony. Approaching the altar, the priest who presided there began to feel quite nervous. He couldn't fathom that despite everything, they desired to unite in matrimony. Thus, he commenced delivering his oration. In a moment, the groom breathed a sigh of relief, assuring that he was greatly apprehensive the monastery would oppose the union. considering his status as the king's extramarital son. However, the heroine believed his tears stemmed from an unwillingness to marry, and indeed, the monastery was against it. Consequently, she dispatched 2 carriages laden with gold to soothe their objections, deeming it prudent to keep this in secrecy. Concluding his sermon, the priest asked them to clasp hands. The bride felt his hands, soft and warm, while he, in turn, perceived her hands adorned with calluses and scars. He even felt a tinge of shame for his own unblemished and tender palms. Nevertheless, he earnestly wished to shield her from any further wounds. Placing a red fabric upon their joined hands, the priest declared it symbolized the shedding of divine blood. It served as an oath for the couple embarking on marital union. Now, as they gazed at each other, a singular thought flitted through their minds. They were finally with the one. As music began to play around, the clergyman entreated them to vow fidelity to each other. The Duchess was the first to speak, but suddenly, behind the guests, an enigmatic gentleman appeared. He signaled to others, and in an instant, the musicians abandoned their instruments, drawing weapons. Rumor circulated that they were setting out to rescue their prince from the clutches of the malevolent Duchess, ruling over the Grand Kingdom of Aden. Fear-stricken, the crowd dispersed, and Count Graham, in terror, sought refuge beneath a table. He couldn't comprehend their intentions, and wondered who dared to act without his command. After all, he was the grandfather of the new king. Behind the attackers, Lasana concealed herself, rejoicing that everything had finally commenced, dreaming that it would unfold smoothly. The Duchess, however, remained undaunted. With a cheerful smile, she uttered the word now, leaving her betrothed behind. She asserted that it was not perilous, and, therefore, there was no need to distance oneself from her. In that moment, she stepped onto the altar, asked the priest to stoop, and with a single movement, overturned it, urging everyone to hide there for the time being. After a moment, the assailants turned to Louis, requesting him to join them, assuring that they could protect him. Yet, he had no intention of aligning with them, and was clueless about their motives. Filled with fear, he reassured his wife that he had no connection with them. She, in turn, comforted him, knowing that he was not involved in this affair. Observing the assailants, Ljubljana commanded them to reveal their identities, but they collectively declared that they do not disclose their names to traitors. Assessing the situation, the heroine noticed a group of 30 individuals here, with an additional 50 archers positioned behind. Nevertheless, she maintained her composure, affirming that such claims sounded ludicrous, as the only traitors present were amongst them. To this, one of the adversaries asserted that she dared to assassinate the king and destabilize the kingdom. He argued that even if they were to proclaim themselves empress and duchess, it did not imply universal recognition. Consequently, he had nothing more to say to such a traitor. Identifying the leader among the attackers, she smiled and assured them that she hadn't heard anything so amusing in a long time, implicitly suggesting that none of these fools who dared to address her in such terms would survive. She retrieved a knife from her bouquet, and began cutting through the skirt concealing another weapon. It was then that the Duchess recollected it had been a considerable amount of time since she had engaged in combat with people. Uncertain if she could restrain her strength, she surprised everyone by revealing her concealed weapon. Nevertheless, despite this revelation, the attackers lunged at her. With a swift motion, Ljubljana pushed her betrothed aside, urging him to remain quiet. She then leaped high into the sky, simultaneously wielding her weapon against the assailants. Upon landing, 2 of them lay lifeless. The heroine swiftly moved past the ranks of attackers, leaving only their lifeless bodies in her wake. Suddenly, 2 more assailants appeared behind Louis, seizing him. In that moment, he contemplated that this might mark the end of his 8th life. However, the Duchess swiftly noticed this, and, with a deft movement, hurled the knife directly at the head of the attacker. Embracing her betrothed, she implored him to close his eyes, assuring him that in this life, his beloved Bio waited. With a single sweeping motion, 2 additional assailants fell to the ground, causing the others to retreat. Realizing that she was indeed a formidable force, even the leader among them was frightened. In fear, he commanded the archers to shoot immediately. The Duchess observed that they must comprehend the precious prince's vulnerability. Nevertheless, the leader maliciously declared that allowing him to live another 4 years would be a greater sin against the kingdom. He was confident in finding more heirs for the king. All bows were aimed at her, and at that moment, the heroine emitted a prolonged whistle. Simultaneously, a hail of arrows rained down from the sky, striking all the assailants. Only the wounded commander remained. The Duchess asked him to repeat how they addressed her, But the man was now pleading for mercy. Ljubljana assured him that if he didn't know, she saw no point in revealing her name to traitors. Thus, his life also came to an end. Lysana observed all of this with horror, knowing that if she were caught, she would undoubtedly be killed. Hiding behind a tree, she was undoubtedly noticed by the Duchess, who, for now, chose to ignore her. Returning to her betrothed, the wife observed that he still stood with closed eyes. She was now entirely covered in blood, uncertain whether she could approach him in such a state. It might be too harsh a spectacle for the scholarly man from the House of Learning, and he could be frightened by seeing her in such a condition. Suddenly, another assassin appeared behind him, ready to carry out his task. However, the heroine timely noticed him and managed to neutralize the threat. Louis informed that he was unharmed, and the bride hurried to him, realizing that there seemed to be no end to their adversaries. Yet, at that moment, an arrow was already hurtling toward him. Nevertheless, Ljubljana swiftly laid the man on the ground and, together with him, took cover. The arrow passed through the remnants of her skirt. It appeared that the assailant intended to kill him with an iron arrow from a powerful bow. The order was given to archers to eliminate the attacker, and at the same instant, the tree from which the shot originated was bombarded with dozens of arrows. The tree was exceedingly dense, allowing the assassin to survive. At this point, the heroine happened to notice a bow near her, and decided that she needed to put an end to this herself. Releasing an arrow, she hit the target precisely, and the lifeless body fell from the tree. In this moment, the heroine realized she had once again displayed cruelty, and now all seemed lost. Therefore, she decided to check on the betrothed, only to find him taking her head in his hands with concern. He inquired about the severity of her injuries, and insisted they should promptly seek a physician. Thus, she should sit astride his back. At that moment, Ljubljana comprehended how long it had been since someone cared so deeply for her. She leaned into him, feeling his warmth, and he assured her that she hadn't sustained any injuries. The blood belonged to others. Grateful for his compost reaction, she felt a sense of appreciation. Taking her hand, he expressed gratitude, acknowledging that she merely sought to protect him. He owed her thanks not only for defending him, but also for remaining unharmed. The heroine struggled to understand this new sentiment, feeling an increased desire to fully possess this person, not just for 3 years but for a lifetime, and if possible, until death. Consequently, the Duchess inquired about the possibility of extending the wedding ceremony. Louis was taken aback. It wasn't the opportune moment for an extension. He proposed conducting it on the following day, yet Ljubljana insisted on an immediate continuation. If the ceremony halted at this point, they would need to reapply to the imperial palace for a new date, restarting the wedding preparations. She couldn't afford to waste 3 years on such trivialities. He suggested weddings occurred only once in a lifetime, and regrets might follow. Nonetheless, the heroine assured him that if he was well, she would like to proceed and wouldn't mind his company. Nevertheless, Louismond willingly agreed, adding that it was precisely what he desired to do first. Out of the corner of her eye, the Duchess observed as the bodies of the assassins were removed. 2 of them differed from the rebels. Their aim was to kill Louismond. It seemed someone had initiated an attempt on his life. Later, the servants began to tidy up the area, rescue the priest, and call the guests back, who were not very pleased, because the ceremony had indeed been decided to continue. Lysana, in particular, was not satisfied. The moment for signing the marital contract arrived, and the heroine began to sign. Suddenly, a drop of blood fell onto the document. She inquired of the priest whether it would be problematic. He, with a horrified expression, assured her that he would do everything to ensure there were no issues. Following this, it was the groom's turn to sign, thus formalizing the union of these 2 individuals. The groom wished to take her hand, but the Duchess began to wipe her hands on the remnants of her gown, as it was stained with blood. The man, impatient, lifted the Duchess, fearing that they would shun him. However, upon receiving reassurance, he decided to continue holding her. Then, he requested her to look only at him. Drawing closer, he declared that he vowed to be devoted to her as a man. She reciprocated with a similar oath, invoking the names of the gods and the land, pledging her allegiance to him. All were moved by this scene, everyone except Lysana. She couldn't comprehend how they could rejoice and smile even in such a situation. The Duchess Monstrous and her fearless consort, in a sense, appeared as the perfect pair. In the face of this, she fled, unable to fathom how Louis could have chosen her. Returning to her abode, Lysana, in tears, realized that Louis loved the Duchess, not her. A woman so terrifying, instilling fear in everyone. As she entered, the butler greeted her, and the aristocrat pretended as if nothing had happened. There wasn't much to do, so she returned earlier. She longed to embrace someone, to cry in the arms of a nanny or at least a maid, but this was not permitted. Upon her return, she faced her father, who declared that Colonel Jael had taken action. It was not a bad choice, as they had been left powerless early on. Even in defeat, it would not harm them significantly. The colonel had always been radical, and everyone believed he would stay, unless she had cut the thread that could lead to unpleasant events. Lysana, trembling, vehemently denied that anything of the sort had occurred. However, her father continued, expressing that she, concealing her identity, had journeyed to the capital and conveyed a message through an unsuspecting servant. Nevertheless, it was not a poor choice, and the outcome was inconsequential. The daughter continued to tremble in fear, to which the master remarked that it wasn't cold here now. With anger, he called her by her full name. Lysana swiftly rose, standing tall, commanding herself to cease trembling and fearing. She needed to be steadfast and lofty. Her father appreciated this gesture, assuring her that it was precisely what was required for the future Queen Aiden. Like Queen Alina, she must be able to protect the first prince from the tyranny of the king. Elegant and unwavering in any situation, she needed to take care of Louiseman to become the Queen of Edina. In response, the girl declared that Louis indeed loved that duchess. However, her father seemed uninterested, emphasizing that as the future queen, she might be enamored with Louiseman, yet she must not overstep boundaries. Still, she appeared quite fatigued now and could return to rest. Alone, the man reassured himself that this girl must become the Queen of Aden. If he had known that everything would unfold this way, he would have shaped her correctly from a young age. A servant entered the room and reported that Count Graham had presented the Salt Mountain. Only that. It seemed he was unaware of the contents of the deal. As the Count erroneously deems himself the focal point of the conspiracy, he fears that the cohesion of the plot will weaken if they turn away from him. Thus, he was queried about acquiring a diamond mine, but he was instructed to leave everything as it is and return the Salt Mountain. This directive surprised the servant, since obtaining the mountain could potentially improve their financial situation. Moreover, it is a remote location, perfect for a military training ground, where their forces could be concealed. The aristocrat asserted that they might be expecting only this, so it's unlikely to be worthwhile to monitor their plan. They probably want to feign their financial standing and military strength. Perhaps they even planted a spy, although more likely, they have already dispatched one. In any case, it is prudent to follow his advice. Alone, the master suddenly burst into laughter. The reason behind it was Duchess Yeshlian. She always knew how to jest and remain unruffled. Now, however, she has suddenly changed, and the prince, who is the descendant of the king, is running away from death. The aristocrat was shocked when the prince, trying to escape death, sought refuge in the abode of scholars. But when the empress destroyed that institution, he abruptly decided to marry Duchess Yeshlian to survive. He chose to venture into the most perilous place for his salvation. Observing such bravery and wisdom, the soul strengthened. Nonetheless, Prince Louiseman will undoubtedly become the king of Aden. No other outcome was possible. The Duchess, in the meantime, orchestrated a conversation with the Count, placing a sword nearby. The bride asserted that if he disapproved of this union, he dared to hire an assassin to end her life. Although he vehemently denied any involvement, the heroine persisted in assuring him of her current displeasure. As her wedding was spoiled, he could no longer dream of encountering Louis. However, if he continued to linger around her duchy, she would arrange an excursion for him to the south. While she knew that this time Count Graham was not implicated, it would not be amiss for him to seek revenge for such mistreatment of her husband. Now, it was time to continue the banquet. Later, members of the imperial administration from the House of Scholars arrived to congratulate Louis, albeit belatedly. All of them were solitary figures, perpetually engrossed in their studies, making him the first among them. They wished him a blissful married life, as there was an old saying, "A wife behind a man is like a stone wall." The gentleman remarked that Peony was conspicuously absent. He was informed that she had requested apologies to be conveyed, expressing her inability to attend. It seemed she had embarked on a caretaking assignment related to the Eastern Waterways project. Lately, due to project preparations, she hadn't even returned home, which displeased the betrothed as she hadn't joined them for lunch. Some time passed, and people from the House of Scholars began to gather their belongings and bid farewell to the betrothed. The dawn was breaking, yet the aristocracy lingered for some inexplicable reason. They gazed at something, as if there was still some matter requiring their attention. The aristocracy awaited the moment when they would finally receive the 5-colored stones to be presented on the wedding altar. These stones symbolized the close ties with the newlyweds' family, following ancient traditions dating back to the days of the Old Kingdom of Aden. According to these customs, if guests who received a stone faced challenging times, they could send it back in a box. In such a case, the family that gave them the stone would be obligated to provide assistance. It was a sign that one could receive support from the Yeshlian duchy once in a lifetime. However, it seemed they had no intention of giving anything now. One of them turned to the duchess, to which she responded with a stern gaze, asking if they had anything to say. Startled, the aristocrat retracted his words. As a farewell gesture, the heroine gave them modest gifts, and they departed, asserting that she was indeed a duchess monster, who had no understanding of noble manners. The actual altar prepared by Louiseman remained at the residence. From the outset, she had no intention of distributing stones to the guests, even if someone had responded to their request. Things might have turned out differently then. On the day she received the news of the tyrant brutally killing their parents, who had come to the capital, the heroine retrieved all the 5-colored stones her parents cherished. She sent each of them with a letter. There were over 20 stones, yet no one responded to that cry of despair. The wedding, the banquet, all unfolded as planned, and now arrived the first bridal night. Louis luxuriated in a bath attended by a servant preparing him for this occasion. Although the groom pondered whether it was truly necessary to go this far, the servant insisted that, regardless of opinions, the first night held great significance. Despite having united their bodies before this, he still felt nervous, contemplating the first night after the wedding. Upon returning to the chamber, he sank onto the bed with difficulty, reassuring himself that his unrest was unnecessary here. Even if his wife hadn't arrived, he convinced himself that her absence was inconsequential. Yet, as she was still nowhere to be found, the man wondered where she might be, and if there were any lingering matters. Meanwhile, in her own chamber, she listened to the spy's report, intended to reveal who disrupted their wedding. She was informed that it was Colonel Jael, tasked with guarding the outskirts of the capital. The Duchess remarked that he had capitulated before the final battle, where the tyrant met his demise. The spy explained that after the surrender, Jael had nothing left but to follow them. Rumor had it that when he was inebriated, he roamed about, shouting about the kingdom of Aden. Intrigued, she wondered if the colonel orchestrated all this without external assistance. She was informed that Duke Dominant continued the investigation, but that was all they had at the moment. Comprehending the entire situation, the Duchess commanded an inquiry into those 2 individuals who attempted to harm Louis. It was deemed necessary to conduct the investigation independently, without the Duke's intervention. Perhaps it would take more time if they didn't leverage his intelligence, yet efforts needed to be exerted to expedite the process. Following the report, the senior chambermaid entered the room. The heroine's first concern was to inquire whether she had suffered any harm earlier in the day. She was assured that neither she nor anyone within the residence had been harmed. However, what was currently of greater importance was whether the Duchess intended to leave her husband without attention on their first conjugal night. Returning to her chamber, she felt greatly fatigued after prolonged debates with the chambermaid, who aimed to attire her appropriately for this special night. Despite it being the inaugural night, the heroine couldn't shake off a slight nervousness. Observing Louis peacefully asleep in the middle of the bed, the Duchess was genuinely vexed for a moment, as this night was meant to be extraordinary. However, she swiftly composed herself, admiring his handsome countenance. Even in slumber, he appeared remarkably attractive. It appeared that today's events had greatly perturbed him. Therefore, the bride simply covered her husband and gently lay beside him. As she gazed upon him now, she realized that such a connubial night would also be suitable. She used to fall asleep more swiftly when she felt the breath of someone sleeping beside her. It had been a long time since she experienced this comfort, be it on the battlefield or in the southern lands. She had always feared this comforting sensation, but she could not grow accustomed to it. Meanwhile, within the domain of Duke Felthurg, the Lord received a report from his subordinates. It conveyed that they had failed in their plan to assassinate Louismond. Now, he wondered if they had been exposed, particularly regarding his orchestration of the assassins. Yet, he was assured that this had not occurred. Coincidentally, the forces of the rebels invaded at the same time, seemingly oblivious to their presence. Convinced that the Duchess was unharmed, he dismissed the spy. However, he was incredibly incensed by the entire situation. In the capital, discussions were swiftly circulating about the intrusion of bandits at the Duchess's wedding. Fears loomed that her wrath, if stirred, would unleash creatures from the south to lay waste to the capital. However, she seemed to have quieted, displaying a cautious demeanor due to the Empress's disdain, stemming from her marriage to the late king's son. While various rumors circulated around, Duchess Yeshlin slept soundly in the arms of her betrothed. She realized she had overslept again, and when Louis awoke, his first deed was to kiss his wife. She had to gently push him away, affirming that it was time to rise, as they still had matters to attend to. This could not persist, as the heroine had been unable to leave the bed for the second week. On the night following the wedding, they simply lay down to sleep. Perhaps it was to gather strength for the nights ahead. At least in Louismond's case, energy overflowed abundantly. Stepping out to have tea, the Duchess inquired of her chambermaid whether she inadvertently overfed her husband discreetly. Upon receiving a denial, she asked what might be the matter with him. In response, the senior servant declared that the young always brim with energy. Ljubljana remarked that they had lived together before this, and little could have changed between spouses. The older woman explained that, in truth, Louis was infatuated with her endlessly, and she should feel the same. Blushing at these words, the Duchess implied her agreement. The chambermaid reassured her that it was a delightful time, so there was no need to distress herself. Instead, she should simply savor the moments. Subsequently, a report from the south fell into the hands of the heroine. It conveyed that the population of creatures was rapidly increasing, likely due to the anticipation of an early onset of winter this year. Therefore, it would be advisable for her to return as expeditiously as possible. However, the mistress of those lands had intentions to persist in disregarding such pleas, deeming them as feigned unhappiness. In a moment, a joyful Louis entered the room, apparently searching for his betrothed. Approaching her, he inquired whether she had completed all her tasks. Upon receiving a refusal, he began to lament, asserting that if it was not urgent, perhaps there was nothing that could be done about it. Consequently, she had no other option but to affirm that matters could wait. Her husband was delighted and, embracing her, asked if there was truly nothing that needed to be attended to immediately. She certainly remembered her sister, and how displeased she would be with such antics. However, considering they were newlyweds, a bit of relaxation might be acceptable. Just as she pondered this, a maid appeared behind them bearing tea. With a gesture, the heroine indicated that Louis was unaware of her presence, and if he noticed, it might be awkward. Hence, it was best for her to depart quietly. Left alone, Louismond continued to profess his love. At that moment, she was incredibly happy, wishing to spend every day like this with her husband. It was a simple dream, yet she felt shattered by some tricksters. Once again, people arrived at her behest, messengers of the Empress, loudly proclaiming the multitude of tasks that needed to be accomplished today. The ruler awaited a response, and there was no room for delay. Eventually, as she sat down with the documents, the men assured her that the royal command also dictated their wait until all the work was completed. Some time passed, and the Empress's subordinates noted that this was the final matter for today. They conveyed a message from Kalina, indicating that a monthly meeting would take place tomorrow, and attendance was obligatory. In response, Ljubljana instructed them to convey to Her Majesty her inquiry about how she could burden her sister, who had just entered wedlock. As she finished, it was evident that dusk had fallen outside. In a moment, Louis entered the room, asserting that she had been engrossed in work from morning till night. Consequently, he brought a tray of food, and the Duchess expressed her desire to alleviate her fatigue. She inquired if there was something to drink, but her husband insisted that she shouldn't drink on an empty stomach. He began to feed her, clearly recognizing it had been a challenging day. After Louis's care, she felt much better. Concluding the dinner, the betrothed announced that it was now time to relieve all her fatigue. He removed her shoes and began massaging her feet, even planting a kiss. Indeed, his heart ached as he beheld Bia's scarred legs. Suddenly, Ljubljana embraced and kissed him, leading him to the couch. Empty bowls clattered to the floor. Initially, she thought she had a rabbit before her, but his eyes resembled those of a beast eager to unleash its passion. In the morning, as attendants entered, bringing water for her ablutions, they were immediately dazzled by a brilliant light filling the room. Upon closer inspection, they noticed that the flush on her countenance not only sparkled but radiated brightly. The Duchess affirmed that she felt an influx of vitality after so much movement. Previously, she seemed to lack physical activity. In that moment, Louis, embracing her, assured her of his great joy. The attendants conversed among themselves, noting the change in the Duchess after the wedding, especially when spending time with Mr. Lewismind. Previously, she had been quite intimidating, and now she appeared to be more amiable. Observing the Duchess dressing, her husband inquired if she had any plans for the day. She informed him of the need to attend the monthly gathering, prompting him to offer to tie her necktie. The Duchess declared that she did not marry him to delegate such tasks, but Louis insisted that he simply wanted to do it for her. He took pleasure in seeing her in a shirt that he had pressed, and in a tie that he himself had tied. In this case, she turned around, blushing, and allowed him to do so. Louis, ecstatic, hesitated to let her go, but eventually accompanied her happily to the carriage. Upon entering the hall for the assembly, the heroine observed that this hall was too vast for the meeting of the Empress and 3 dukes. In a moment, the rest of the dukes appeared, who immediately noticed that she seemed to have blossomed during the time she had not left her abode. After a brief contemplation, she contentedly requested them not to harbor envy, suggesting they marry as soon as possible. Dominant affirmed that he desired this and sought their assistance. Felthurg, however, remained silent with evident displeasure. Ljubljana assured them that she wholeheartedly embraced the idea, emphasizing the necessity for them to enter into matrimony. Following this, Felthurg finally inquired about her specific inclinations. She assured him that she admired absolutely everything. At that moment, the gentleman struck the table, surprising the other attendees. They approached, asking the reason for his outburst and inquiring if he had any grievances.